Heather, let me know when we're live, and Representative Western will join remotely. He's at a wedding. He decided not to make the family as mad as me, so he has to live with them. He just has to work with me. We're live. Okay. So for everybody, welcome to the first interim committee for the Minerals Business Economic Development Committee. Especially welcome any members of the public that are here. Great to have you. Look forward to any testimony you have to give. And it's great to be in camera. I think, Mr. Co-Chair, this is the first time we've had a committee meeting in camera that I know of.
Worked hard to get it here.
Yeah, I know that. So a couple things. This meeting will be civil and respectful, and I think most of my committee at least know that I have a very short fuse when it's not. They do know that based on work during the session. So other thing, remember to address the chair. We have a lot of heavy discussion. And Heather, why am I getting feedback? Any other mics on? No? Okay. All right, I'll push that thing away. Usually we have to bring these things a little closer. So with that, we'll get kicked off. Please call the roll, Heather.
Senator Cooper.
Here.
Senator Ellis. Senator Jones.
Here.
Senator Rothfuss.
Here.
Representative Banks.
Here.
Representative Conrad.
Here.
Representative Heiner.
Here.
Representative Knapp.
Here.
Representative Larson.
Here.
Representative Lawley.
Here.
Representative Tarver.
Here.
Representative Western.
Here.
Should be.
Present. Heather, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you.
Co-Chairman Dockstetter.
Here.
Chairman Burkhart.
Here.
You have a quorum.
A couple things. We will finish today's work today. We have people who need to get back to Cheyenne later today, so we will finish up the agenda today. So I'd ask everyone to stay on subject. Keep your comments germane. If you ramble, I will let you know you're rambling on that. So with that, our first order of business will be adoption of committee rules. Brian, would you take us through those, please?
Okay, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, the rules are 102 in your committee notebook. What I will do is just go through the proposed changes as the chairman have directed them. So the changes on page 1 right at the top are mostly just conforming changes to reference the Minerals Committee. Then section 1A2 is a new sentence that says one chairman shall preside over each day of the meeting. And Mr. Chairman, based on, I think, your direction, you may want to consider deleting that sentence. Then 1A and a new subsection 6 just provides that the co-chairman have the discretion to determine the order and the available time for both in-person and online public comment. So basically just codifies in the rules your discretion on managing public comment. Then moving on to page 2, section D is just rewritten to state that the quorum for the joint committee is a majority of the members of the joint committee, and then a majority of the quorum may act on any matter, and that would include voting to sponsor any legislation as a committee, would simply require a vote of the entire joint committee. Then moving on to page 3, new subsection F, so 2F is a new language about an online public comment dress code that just requires that persons who provide comment online during an interim shall wear attire similar to the attire expected for in-person comment and during session. Then finally, Mr. Chairman, section 3B toward the bottom of page 3 is a new sentence for the motion to reconsider that just specifies that any motion to reconsider or rescind an action of the committee, whether made at the same meeting or made for a subsequent meeting with the 15 days advance notice, would require a second. And then throughout the rules, Mr. Chairman, are just conforming changes to reference you and Chairman Dockstetter as co-chairman rather than a chairman and a vice chairman. With that, Mr. Chairman, I'll stand for questions.
Any questions for staff? Questions? Okay. Do I hear a motion on the adopting the rules?
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion that we adopt the rules to include obviously section 1A2 to delete one chairman will provide.
Representative will do the motion on the,
Okay,
all the rules and then do amendments.
thank you. I make a motion to approve.
Okay, moved and seconded. Okay, any amendments? Representative Conrad, your turn.
Yes, sir. Mr.
Again.
Chairman, to adopt the previously communicated change on section 1A2, delete one chairman shall preside over each day of the meeting.
Everyone clear on that? That deletes the proposed new wording, reverts to the existing wording. Is there a second on that?
Second.
Okay, seconded by Larson. Okay, any discussion? Okay, we're voting on amendment to delete the last line of section IA2. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed, no. Okay, that carries. Any other amendments on proposed rules? I think I heard the question called. So do we need to take roll on this, Brian? I think we do.
The adoption of the rules, Senator Cooper. Senator Ellis. Senator Jones. Senator Rothfuss. Representative Banks. Representative Conrad.
Aye.
Representative Heiner.
Aye.
Representative Knapp.
Aye.
Representative Larson.
Aye.
Representative Lawley. Representative Tarver.
Aye.
Representative Western.
Aye.
Co-chairman Dockstetter. Chairman Burkhart.
Aye.
14 aye.
Thank you. So staff, I would ask that you prepare those and get those to the committee when we're done. One thing that is not in the rules, just to clarify, is Senator Dockstetter and I have discussed it. We will not allow any absentee voting. You're here to vote. You cannot vote absentee in an interim committee meeting. So you're either here or you're not. Okay. So with that, first up is carbon capture utilization and storage technology. And we're going to start with some background information. And I would ask for everyone's indulgence on this. We are going to skip around a little bit. We'll start with the basics, move up through statute and any changes we need to make. And that this is a complex issue. I've asked the presenters to take it slowly so that we all understand what we're dealing with, and there will be some policy decisions that we'll have to consider. Ryan, you have a question? Oh, okay. All right. So with that, Fred, I'll let you go first, but I'm going to ask you to start with an announcement you have for the committee and actually for all the public watching.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I am happy to announce right now that just yesterday, the University of Wyoming received news that we landed our biggest grant award ever, $40 million directly from the federal government to develop a carbon storage field in Southwest Wyoming outside of Granger in conjunction with Carbon Frontier Solutions. This will help serve industries in the Southwest from Trona to maybe direct air capture to even some of the oil and gas that already exists. So thank you for allowing me to share that news. We're very excited.
So thank you, Fred. And I think for everyone's, that gives you an idea of the status that Wyoming School of Energy Resources, the university, have in the area of carbon capture and why this is such a major topic for us at this time. It's a new industry. It's kind of old technology, but some new stuff and that. And I'll start with Fred and then Travis McLinn with the Idaho National Laboratory on well, we'll just do the introduction and start with the basics and work up from there. So Fred, proceed. And by the way, for all of you sitting here, if you're sitting in the audience and I know you have information I want, I'm going to call on you anyway, even if you're not listed. There's a rule we have, which is don't show up to a meeting you weren't invited to. You could find yourself testifying. So just wanted to set you all up for that so that you know, if you're trying to hide behind someone else, it's probably not going to work. So with that, Fred, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And again, thanks for allowing me to come here today and introduce some of the work that the university's done and provide a high level background on carbon capture, utilization and storage. Is the chairman mentioned, it is a new old technology, and I'll cover some of that quickly. So I'd like to start with some of the background, how this industry evolved. And of course, there's been industrial gas storage in the United States for well over a century. So on the left, you'll see a map provided by the USGS, which shows different areas that are actively storing natural gas, largely for heat and energy in the United States. You see it's fairly well dispersed. I'll point out on that map things that are interesting that we have pulled over is the fact that obviously Wyoming is already storing natural gas, but also there's different geologic formations that we look to. In this case, aquifers, depleted fields, and salt domes to find good regions to store natural gas safely. I'll point to the graph on the right, which captures gas storage. You can see it's temporal and dynamic. I just want to point out that there are large volumes of natural gas that go in geologic formations across the United States annually, and it is certainly something that continues to grow. I'll move to the next slide. And Wyoming, of course, already has an extensive background in carbon dioxide management, injection, and storage, specifically with our CO2 enhanced oil recovery industry. So on the left, you'll see the state of Wyoming with different geologic fields wherein they have done CO2 injection since, in some cases, since the 1980s. So we have 40 years of experience here. All the way up into Montana, and this is an older map. I do apologize. This pipeline now moves close to the border of North Dakota. So this is the the Denbury Green Corps pipeline, and I think some of you went to Chute Creek yesterday and toured that plant. It is getting CO2 from that plant, is moving across different geologic fields and into different geologic fields in Wyoming for the purpose of enhanced oil recovery. For the table on the left, I'd like to point out some of the cumulative volumes put into the ground. You can see our biggest active field, and this is from 2017, figures courtesy of the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute, has recycled over 130 million metric tons of CO2. And again, that was 5 years ago to date. And so Wyoming already has an existing and robust CO2 management industry that is actively helping state industry. So these are some of the background data and learning in the industry that we're allowed, luckily enough, to build some of our CCUS research off of at the university.
Fred, hold on just for a minute.
Sure.
Heather, is there any way to kill some of this feedback and echo? Okay. Is there a particular reason for it?
Not that I know of. I'm working on things.
Okay, because it is kind of distracting, I know, in here and probably to our people who are listening in the virtual realm. So Fred, continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So this is the reason I'm here today, to largely high level introduce what CCUS is to the Minerals Committee this morning, and I do appreciate that opportunity. So on the right is a very simple diagram that the School of Energy put together as part of educational material to introduce carbon capture and storage. It is based on work we've done in the Northern Powder River Basin. So it's a diagram of the subsurface, roughly going to 9,000 feet. And I like to point out a couple of the important pieces on this diagram. One, we are actively doing resource assessment for injection reservoirs, and the resource itself is pore space. So those are the void spaces that have been retained in the rock for hundreds of millions of years, wherein you could put something like a CO2. The bottom figure there is actually a microphotograph from a core we collected at 9,500 feet below the surface of the Metallusa Formation, potential injection target at Dry Fork Station. I'd like to point out the blue there is a epoxy we put in the lab to show where the pore space is within the rock, where it naturally exists. And that's one of the ways we study it. The small white blobs are sand grains that were put down in an ancient desert when Wyoming was a much different place geologically. Moving forward here, just a couple of high points to share with the folks here today. Injection reservoirs exist all over Wyoming. I'm sure this is inherent to the group here because this is the place where we get a lot of our oil and gas. But CCUS cannot impede mineral resources in any way, shape, or form. So one of the things we do while we're exploring for CO2 resources, in this case, the pore space, as look for reservoirs that were never charged with hydrocarbons. They also must be saline. And by saline, it means the formation fluids must be greater than 10,000 parts per million. This is a requirement as part of the regulatory Class 6 rules. And this is in order to protect groundwater resources across the state. So these are the first two things as geologists or our scientists were looking for a CO2 injection target. We also look for reservoirs that are deeper than 3,000 feet. The reason being is we would prefer to keep the CO2 in what's called a supercritical state. So instead of a gas phase, it's condensed into the next, it's more like a liquid. And of course, this goes back very simply to the resources of pore space, and pore space is limited. So we want to get as much out of that pore space as we can by condensing the density of the CO2. Again, just a couple of high points on the right or on the left as bullets. Part of the exploration herein is to make sure we can meet Class 6 regulatory permitting requirements. I'm sure this will be covered more in depth by our colleagues at the DEQ later in the day, but this is one of the most rigorous types of injection permit in the United States. There is a lot of science and liability and responsibility that goes behind meeting one of these, and it's sometimes a multi-year study to make sure that we can do this safely. Last but not least, I'd like to just point out some of the different volumes. If you remember back to the previous slide, wherein Salt Creek had recycled close to 130 million metric tons through one of the reservoirs north of Casper, a medium-sized industrial plant such as a fertilizer or cement plant can emit anywhere between 150,000 to 300,000 metric tons per year of CO2. A medium-sized coal power plant, say in Wyoming, can emit between 2.5 to 4.0 million metric tons of CO2, so a whole order of magnitude greater. So again, back to source and sink, how we talk about as a geologist, we're looking for reservoirs that are capable of taking CO2 from point sources like an industrial or power plant and then safely storing it underground. And that necessitates the volume of pore space necessary, saline aquifer, no mineral estates that we would be impeding, and last but not least, very thick, reliable cap rocks. Those type of rocks that act as seals, they're impermeable to fluid flow, and Wyoming has fantastic cap rocks. Again, if you were able to go out to Chute Creek yesterday, they're actively producing helium from those reservoirs, helium that has been accumulating over the last 100 million years and has not escaped through those cap rocks. That is simply amazing in some regards with respect to fluid movement. Again, the CCUS methodology, the workflow, and the industry itself was based on lessons learned from 100 years of gas injection and 40 plus years of CO2 management injection in Wyoming. This is a graph provided by the EPA that you can follow. It points out some of the high level needs to get to these different pieces
We're back.
We're back. Okay, you didn't take a break or something. Fred, proceed, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, so this is, again, just to step back a minute, this is the operational workflow developed by the by the EPA to help meet carbon capture, utilization, and storage permitting requirements and needs. So each of these 4 stages vary depending on what you have to do here, and I don't think it's important for me to read through all of these. I just want the committee to know that these are well established and everybody follows the same guidelines to make sure that they're doing safely and securely. And the university, we work a lot, obviously, on research on uncertainty, though the School of Energy Resources is focused on commerciality. Much of our research lies in that very first arrow on the left, where we're working to understand as much as we can about the science, about the geology, about the environmental concerns in the region to allow people to go to that next commercial stage, which is permit to construct, which again, I do believe our colleagues at the DEQ will expand upon later this afternoon or this and the agenda. Moving on, I'd like to highlight some of the research that the university has pushed forward under this topic at the School of Energy Resources. And I do apologize, Mr. Chairman, I did not have time to update the slide with the new award, which would be number 5 then on this graph somewhere between, or slide somewhere between number 2 and 3. To date, the university's most advanced CCUS project is the Wyoming Carbon Safe at Dry Fork Station. It's in phase 3 as described by the DOE, but it's very commercially focused. We've drilled 2 wells to date that meet the Class 6 regulatory standards with a goal of providing that region carbon storage hub potential within the next 3 years. I'd also like to point out on this graph that CCUS is necessary for some other burgeoning industries, such as hydrogen. So number 4 on that graph is Project Blue Bison. That was another DOE award that was led by Tallgrass to determine the potential for developing a hydrogen hub around Douglas that would also necessitate carbon capture and storage. So as they produce hydrogen, one of the other products they would produce is CO2. And again, the university helped there trying to establish the carbon management and storage potential of that neck of the woods. Of course, SER is above board or all of the above approach with respect to Wyoming's industry. So we've looked at coal-fired power plants. We've helped look at different industrial emitters, and we also do studies on depleted oil and gas fields, as does our sister institute, the Enhanced Oil Recovery Institute in Casper. But again, depleted gas fields potentially offer a way for Wyoming industry to use their field assets in a new way for a longer duration. And again, expand that industrial knowledge into the next phase of maturity. And Mr. Chairman, I'd like to move on if that's okay, and just highlight some of the big picture here, kind of a wrap-up slide, so that the committee has some great talking points to share with their constituents. So the current activity in CCUS development in Wyoming is largely focused on the Powder River, the Green River, and the Denver-Julesburg Basin. The reason being there are prevalent sources in those regions. There's existing transportation infrastructure, and there's a known geologic storage capacity. As I mentioned in the previous slide, Wyoming is very lucky to have an experienced CCUS-ready workforce. That is not inherent to the rest of the United States. There's only a few states that actually have carbon management industries. That puts it ahead. We have a long-standing, thanks to a lot of foresight from a lot of Wyoming leaders, we have a long-standing regulatory framework, which has helped to reduce business risks for people looking to come to the state and develop the CCUS industry. We have Class 6 primacy, which again will be discussed later in the day. And thanks again to a longstanding program in the university and other places, even with industry colleagues, we have an existing statewide assessment of our geologic resources, economic environmental impacts, potential transportation impacts and pathways, and different developmental strategies to help push these type of projects forward. And last but not least, I will highlight the fact that we are recognized now as national leaders in CCUS at the School of Energy Resources at the University of Wyoming. And with that, I'm happy to take any questions, Mr. Chairman, from the committee.
Thanks, Fred. Any questions for Mr. McLaughlin? Questions? And by the way, thank you for fixing the microphones. It's appreciated. No questions? Everyone understands it. Now I'll ask and you can explain it back to me. Chris, I know you can. I'm looking at Representative Larson. Okay. So, okay, Fred, I guess you answered every single question people have.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you all for your service.
So but why don't you stay there at the table? And with that, Travis McLinn with the Idaho National Laboratory. And Travis, do you have slides or a presentation? Okay.
Remind me of somewhat of not following instructions. I guess the hard copies didn't make it.
Okay.
I guess the hard copies didn't make it to your desk.
Okay. Everyone here has a photographic memory, so they don't need the hard copies.
I will be able to make them available and they will
Okay,
be,
thank
will be
you.
projected on the
So
meeting.
if I might, before you start, just so everyone knows, while normally we look at the Idaho National Laboratory as being a nuclear reactor, nuclear power research center, they do a lot of tremendous other work. CO2 sequestration, capture, usage, rare earth elements. Was over there recently, they're doing work into all the hype on 5G for your cell phones, which I found out that most cell phones really don't have 5G yet. So it's all advertising, but they do a lot of other stuff. I invited Travis here for another point of view from a research facility. And I know you have plenty of good information to share. So Travis, I think if we're ready, proceed.
Do we have my slides up?
Do we have them up yet?
Chairman, we don't have any slides.
You,
You don't have any slides? So how can I project? I can mail them to you or I can project them on the screen if we need.
Mr. Chairman.
yes, Representative Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If he could email them to staff, so staff can email them to the committee so that we can get them on our screens. We don't, other than the fact,
If
I
we
could
don't have
do-
them up
I
here, the
could do
public can't
this.
see them.
well, no, both is what I'm
Yeah.
looking for. Exactly. Thank you.
So we'll take a minute, Travis, while you do that.
Okay. The emails were sent, but apparently
My policy. You know what? No, we come back. So that-
you have them. I can't use them. No, not since I sent them to you.
Yeah. You know how to fix that. You gonna get it?
This is the reason Senator Rothfuss is on the committee. Someone has to explain to the rest of us how to plug our computers in. Travis, did you get those emailed to Heather? Okay. I imagine Heather here, it'll take a minute to go from Idaho to Cheyenne to somewhere else and finally back to you. And we're starting to get an echo again.
That might be one on. No?
Mine's on. Just a minute, see if Heather gets that. If not, I'll just let you start. Oh, okay.
Mr. Chairman, they did arrive, so they're just being pulled up now.
We'll give Heather a minute to send those out to the committee and to put them up on the board.
Yes, sir. That's fine with me.
Okay, I think we're ready, and with the mics, we'll have to be cautious and only have one on at a time. The minute there are two on is when we start getting the feedback. So with that, Travis, please.
Yeah.
Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. It's a privilege to be here today, and congratulations to University of Wyoming. I will add to what Fred said is that University of Wyoming SER is not just nationally renowned; they are globally renowned for their carbon sequestration work. So today we're gonna tell a bit of a story and talk about carbon sequestration and why it matters. We've been working in the field of carbon sequestration in the science and engineering community for about 3 decades now. And that interest is that we could see in the coming years that there was going to be a looming issue, and that issue is associated with carbon concentrations in the atmosphere. And so we have been addressing the scientific and engineering issues associated with CCS and how to mitigate carbon emissions for a long time. And that the reason it isn't important to us in the West here, and of course to the country, is that we get a lot of our power from coal resources. As a young boy, I remember watching my uncles. We came up here and worked on the Jim Bridger plant and helped build that plant. We'd come up and visit it. And so it's been into my life for as long as I can remember. So carbon sequestration is really exactly what it sounds like. It is taking carbon dioxide or other carbon oxides, that is carbon bound with oxygen, and it is taking that carbon dioxide from that would otherwise be emitted to the atmosphere, capturing it and placing it into a secure reservoir. Now, there's a variety of those, and I'll talk about those in a moment, but there's a variety of types of what we call secure storage. It is a proven technology, as Dr. McLaughlin said. It is off the shelf, ready to go. The permitting and regulatory status of those kinds of operations are really what's holding it up currently. We are within the price window that would allow for commercial scale, large national scale carbon sequestration, if we can sort ourselves out on the assurity side of things, or on the making sure that the permanency issues are settled. The reason why we're all here and why we're all talking about this is because there is a significant amount of resources, dollars involved in carbon capture and storage these days. One is starting in 2008, the 45Q tax policy was passed. And in 2008, I always thought we kind of missed an opportunity nationally there, is that the monetization of carbon sequestration was set, and the number was pretty low at that point. Since 2008, in 2018, the 45Q tax credits were changed, and the cost or the pay back for sequestering carbon dioxide and other carbon oxides is has been significantly increased. For example, I can give you an example here, is that in the prior law back in 2008, maximum payment for or offset for dedicated carbon storage was about $50 a ton. In the IRA amendments, it's up to $85 a ton. If one looks at the IRA amendment for direct air capture, which is capturing CO2 directly from the atmosphere, those numbers can reach up to $180 per ton. For utilization, that is using carbon dioxide for some other purpose. At Idaho National Laboratory, we look at carbon dioxide in a multiple different ways. But one of those ways is to push the carbon dioxide back up the thermodynamic hill and make it into a feedstock. Carbon has value. And so we can use the carbon dioxide. If we have enough energy, we can put carbon dioxide back into the chemical feed chain. And so it has value. And so there's other ways of utilization, but that number has gone from $35 a ton to about $60 a ton. And again, for direct air capture, it's up to about $130 a ton there. And then for secure geologic storage, and Dr. McLaughlin mentioned that, Mr. Chairman, a moment ago, is secure storage is the big hitch right now, is to be able to demonstrate legally and regulatorily that CO2 is stored. Prior law in 2008 was about $35 per ton. Current for geologic storage is about $60 per ton, and that number will increase with and be adjusted for inflation. And again, for direct air capture, it's about $130 a ton. So there's a lot of money in the system to do this kind of work. And it's for states that have resources in the subsurface where you can stick carbon dioxide. It's a good way to monetize and recoup costs associated with carbon sequestration. So it's not just a science and engineering question. It's not just a question that's on the news about climate change. It's a question of how do we do the right thing and how do we capitalize in states like the states of the West where carbon issues have been pointed out. How do you take advantage of that and reap the rewards for your schools and your public? So the tax policies aren't just here in the United States; they are all across the world. The European Union is quite active in that. China and Asia are very active in carbon sequestration. Dr. Tara Rogetti provided some of these slides that you're seeing right now, and the shows that there are a lot of opportunities for carbon sequestration, a lot of opportunities to take the technology that's developed here and move it out into the global realm. And I know University of Wyoming has been active in that over the years. But let me talk a little bit about, go ahead.
Senator Roftus.
Sorry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. These aren't very easy to kind of do an apples to apples comparison with what we have versus the tax policy in Canada versus what the EU is doing. Has that type of economic analysis been done at all to sort of compare the level of investment by the respective governments in carbon capture technologies? In other words, if I were doing the same project in each of the three locations, which would be the most cost effective?
Mr. Chairman, please
proceed.
Yes, and Dr. Rogetti would be a good source of that. I'm a pretty simple rock licker, just a geologist, so I'm not qualified to speak on that. But if you go into the literature and look, even if you do a simple Google search, you can look at the apples to apples comparisons of what carbon costs and what the tax incentives are across the different national protocols and as a European Union. So I hope that answers the question, Mr. Chairman. Right. So 45Q is what has allowed us to move forward from the theory and the idea of carbon sequestration into the industrialization of carbon sequestration. It's provide the monetary pathway for that to happen. And here in Wyoming, we're at the very leading edge of that and addressing those various issues associated with how do we get into the ground and make sure that we don't just get litigated until we don't have any money left to do the work. The 45Q requires a secure geologic storage. And secure geologic storage is a definition that's different for a fellow like me who's a geologist and for somebody who's an environmental lawyer. And so we have to make sure that we bring the standards to a common place. That means that the CO2 that would have been emitted to the atmosphere as a qualified oxide, that is a carbon bound with oxygen, needs to be injected into, not early on, it was just into a saline reservoir. That is a very deep sedimentary formation where water chemistries are greater than 10,000 parts per million, as Dr. McLaughlin mentioned previously. It needs to be captured at an industrial source. And what we're talking about here is carbon dioxide that would have otherwise gone to the atmosphere. And that's an important part of this is that we're now making sure that that carbon dioxide goes into a secure storage. And the volume we talked about earlier, the question was posed about apples to apples is what does volume mean? How much are we and how much can you take credit for? And it's based on a life cycle analysis of the greenhouse gas emissions from a point source or from a power plant, from a cement factory, from a steel mill, whatever the case may be. And it needs to be measured and verified. And so essentially what you do is you look at the life cycle analysis, you look at the plant, how much CO2 it emits, and then you look at the point at which you inject and you measure that volume of CO2 that's going into the ground. And then over time, you then measure the amount that's in the ground so that you can continue to receive those credits. CO2 that goes into the ground and then leaks into another formation or is lost to the atmosphere again is then you have to recompensate for that. So as I'd mentioned earlier, credits for geologic storage, $60 a ton. This is well within the range of feasibility for industrial scale. And CO2 for EOR utilization can be up as high as $85 a ton. Oh, that was twisted around. Excuse me. They are backwards. Excuse me. So for CO2 geologic storage is $85 a ton, and for EOR it is $60 per ton. Thank you, Dr. McLaughlin. And then we encourage the use of anthropogenic CO2 to get a higher credit. So you're taking this carbon dioxide that was going to go to the atmosphere and we're putting into the ground. So I'll skip on now and go. So we talked about that, and I'm not a very good representative to discuss the monetary side of this. Where I'm really good at is discussing the fundamentals of and the engineering and geologic aspects of carbon sequestration. It's not caught up. Okay.
Mr. Chairman.
Representative Heiner, question.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Travis, you mentioned that it has to be a qualified carbon oxide. So therefore, a carbon monoxide could also receive 45Q tax credits if those were sequestered as well as carbon dioxide?
Dr. McLean?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct.
Then, and I'll just add a personal thing in there. For some of the chemical processes, you'd rather use carbon monoxide than carbon dioxide. Question, Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to, while we're stopped, go back to your talking about what I think I heard was.
You need to get a little closer to that
Okay.
microphone.
What I think I heard was that there's a discrepancy with regard to the way the 45Q tax credit defines the secure geological storage and the way it might be defined in other arenas. Did I understand that correctly?
Dr. McLean?
Representative, or excuse me, Chairman Burkhart. Perhaps that was not quite my intention. There is that 45Q has its standards. The definition of what is secure is in the public space. That are folks who have a position on either side. For a geologist like myself, one would look at a formation and say that the CO2 would never make it based on what we know about the system and calculations and models that we can do and the data that's been collected. However, somebody with a legal background may look at the dust in the corners and say that there is uncertainty associated with your ability to measure that CO2 to the criteria that meets the standard. So that's where the issue comes from. It's not within the law itself. It's within the interpretation of what is secure.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Who arbitrates that decision? Who ultimately, when there's conflict, how does, do you know anything about how that works? If you don't, that's fine, but to me, it's just a natural thing to think about next, who works that difference out.
Dr. McLean?
I'm going to go ahead and pass on that. Perhaps Dr. McLaughlin is more qualified to speak on that. Okay, DEQ is coming in later and we'll let them do that. But these are discussions that are had and they're well outside. Sometimes they're well outside of the scientific framework.
Yeah, thank
Okay,
you.
Director Parfit, write that one down. Todd. Oh, or Holly want to answer that one. Okay, so Dr. McLean, proceed, and while they're working on an answer, we'll take it up here shortly.
Thank you, Chairman. So I'm just going to look at this, put this slide up pretty quickly that Dr. Brigetti provided me, and it is it really shows the impact of carbon policy and how climate change is going to hit communities. You can look at this slide here and you can see the communities, and Wyoming. I'm not sure what the square in the center means, but Wyoming's a heavily impacted, and our neighboring states are heavily impacted by climate policy and what's going to happen in the future. But if you look on the right, there's an awful lot of money in the system that would allow for addressing a lot of the aspects associated with transition or with carbon sequestration. So with that, I'll pass out of the monetization side. I will just add what Dr. McLaughlin said earlier today, is that what's really important here is the value of the pore space that beneath our feet. That is where the carbon dioxide is going to go and permanently reside. And that represents an opportunity for landowners and others to be able to lease or to transfer and exchange for a price that pore space down in the ground. And it's a big opportunity in states like Wyoming, where there's so much pore space available. And all along the Rocky Mountain front and across the breadbasket of the United States there's good opportunities there for that. And if we can just get to a point where we can all agree that permanency is defined and satisfied, then there's a lot of pore space that can be then monetized. And that's where, again, Dr. Brigetti is an expert in this area. All right, so we're going to go transition now into the geologic side of things, and I'm going to talk a little bit about carbon sequestration, add to what Dr. McLaughlin has said earlier. So geologic sequestration, and here we're going to go back and remember that it's carbon oxide, but we primarily discuss carbon dioxide. And carbon dioxide is important because it is a reactive molecule in the subsurface. Carbon dioxide dissolves in water and forms carbonic acid. And that carbonic acid is then able to interact with the rocks in the subsurface and is able to then convert from carbon dioxide gas into, or supercritical fluid, into a solid mineral phase, which is not available for re-entry to the atmosphere over geologic times. When geologists wave their arms wide, we're talking about millions and millions of years, perhaps hundreds of millions of years. So we have a goal of sequestering that CO2 in the subsurface, as Dr. McLaughlin said, using the cap and trap methodology, and then over time that CO2, depending on the rock type, will then mineralize into a more stable form, and it is irreversible on the timeframes that humans think about. Depleted oil and gas reservoirs have always been a big target because there's money to be made on the backside of that, recovering the hydrocarbons. Saline aquifers are really a big deal because they're huge, they're vast, and they're everywhere across the globe. I'll show you a map in a moment on that. Deep coal beds have at one time been considered. There's still a potential, but they have not been evaluated with as much potential. Mafic rocks. Now these are rocks like we have in Idaho, like you have in Hawaii, like you have on the seafloor of the world, is that these are rocks that are highly reactive to carbon dioxide. And those mineralization rates I talked about, where the conversion of carbon dioxide to a stable mineral phase happens on the order of years instead of millennia. And so they're important, and the work that we're doing at Idaho National Laboratory complements the work that's being done at University of Wyoming and other places, looking at the mineralization of carbon dioxide, so that the surety part of that equation is a lot shorter. It's something that people that we can deal with on the time frame that societies have been around long enough for. And then a big area that's gaining a lot of attention and it's very difficult is direct air capture. When we talk about capturing carbon dioxide from Jim Bridger, we're talking about capturing a carbon dioxide stream that's quite high. When we talk about carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, we're talking about capturing carbon dioxide in an airstream in this room that is about 400 parts per million. And so you have to move a lot of air in order to get it into a system that can capture it. It requires an immense amount of energy. But then on the backside, you still have to sequester that CO2 into a geologic formation. And I talked about this. I'm going to skip the next one, but the sequestration process is capture, compression, storage, transportation, and storage, and then ultimately secure storage through mineral trapping. Fred covered this pretty well. I'll cover it one more time in case there's a question, is that we look at storing the carbon dioxide at depth greater than about 1 kilometer. We want to have enough water pressure on top of that carbon dioxide that it doesn't convert back from a supercritical or liquid phase into a gas phase. So by having that much water head on top of it, one is it doesn't spontaneously turn back into a gas. And then number two is that we're well below drinking water systems or aquifers, and that we don't have that environmental impact. So we're well below any area which would impact agriculture or community waters. And so that's important, in that it stays there under pressure because it has a seal down there, and that seals are things that have been worked on. What defines a seal? Carbon dioxide is a little more slippery than water, and it's able to move through smaller fractures and smaller cracks. So you have to have a seal that has quite high integrity. Just to give you a sense of the timeframes that we're looking at here really quickly, is that before you even get ready to do a carbon sequestration, you have to do site characterization. And that can be anywhere between 1 and 5 years. We don't have a lot of these that have gone into deployment, but based on other types of industrial injection operations that we've looked at, we're looking at between a 1 and a 5 year operation. And then the permitting and application. Initially, when this slide was put together, it looked like it was about a year. That's way too short. The permitting and application part is much too long. And then the injection is over the life cycle of a plant of operation. And so it's up to many decades. And then closure, how long are you going to observe it? And how long are you going to button it up, make sure the formation is sealed, the monitoring network set up can be on the order of a decade or so. And then long-term stewardship. And what is long-term stewardship is? That is, how long do you have to watch the system in order to make sure that the CO2 is still down there? And that's an important question, because somewhere somebody was paid to put that CO2 down there. And there's going to be somebody that's going to be required to watch that CO2 and make sure it's still there, or they're going to send you a bill that says you lost this amount of CO2 and it needs to be repaid. The scale of the operations we're talking about here are pretty large. Reservoir operations. So when in Wyoming, when we look at extracting hydrocarbons from reservoirs, you look at the kind of scale in years, and you look at the kind of scale in dimensions. You can see the scale is on the order of nearly 100 years, and the space is on an order of a few hundred cubic kilometers over time, square kilometers, excuse me. Carbon management, in order to address the amount of CO2 that's in the atmosphere and the CO2 that's going to go into the atmosphere in the future, is going to represent one of the largest activities that humans, or the largest activity that humans have ever done in the subsurface, larger than mining and larger than extraction technologies that got that carbon dioxide into the atmosphere in the first place, or that got it to the power plant. So we're looking at a scale that's very large. Doesn't mean each individual operation will be very large. It means that cumulative across the globe, it's going to be a very large operation. So it's important to remember that this isn't something that we just do at one plant, or that we do in one reservoir. We do CO2 in order to meet our climate objectives globally, and it requires a lot of wells, it requires a lot of space, it requires a lot of pore space, and that requires a lot of permitting and application. Just to give you a quick overview here, if you take a look, you can see distribution of some of these sedimentary basins out there. Most of the globe has access to suitable sequestration reservoirs, and these sequestration reservoirs have been characterized either through hydrocarbon recovery or for carbon dioxide storage. And
Dr. McQueen, Will you
Chairman.
define, would you, for the committee and others, sedimentary basin?
Yes.
I know how geologists are. I've dealt with Fred in the past and that. So some of the terms might need some explanation to the committee. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm happy to do so. Sedimentary basins are basins, when Dr. McLaughlin talked about earlier that there were seas, when Wyoming was covered by a sea. Anytime you have a low spot on the earth, you have an ocean, you have an inland sea, you have a lake, sediment collects in those areas. And then the sediment collects over periods of time. And as sea level rises and falls, you get cycles of sequence from sands and to shales and siltstones. So there are stacks of rocks that are made up of bits and pieces of other rocks that were washed off of the continents into these basins. And so if we go right outside right now, if we took a little walk outside and we went up on the hill right here, we would see sedimentary rocks up here and sedimentary formations. So that, I don't know if that's a very satisfying definition of what they are, but they are, and they do have an intrinsic permeability. That is that the particles are together in such a way that there's an internal pore space that allows fluid to flow in them. Mr. Chairman, was that acceptable? And I'll just go back to add really quickly that Wyoming has a lot of these opportunities, a lot of sedimentary, thousands of meters of sedimentary rock that are suitable for carbon sequestration and have the kind of caps that we need to keep it down there. I hope this still fits the fundamentals of carbon sequestration, but Dr. McLaughlin mentioned this earlier, is that we want to store the carbon dioxide as a supercritical phase, and for simplicity, you can think of it as a liquid phase, and carbon dioxide goes from a gas that fills a huge volume to a supercritical phase, and there's a giant volume reduction. And so injecting a gas into the subsurface is very difficult because it takes up a lot of volume. Injecting a supercritical fluid into the subsurface is not so difficult because it's a very compressed liquid. If you look at the figure right there, you can see how that density increases. Density means that the gas takes up less volume over there. So you can see the relative volume. If you start at zero pressure, at atmospheric pressure, you can see that the density is about 700 kilograms per meter cube. Now, what does that mean? It means that it's about 75% as dense as water. And then as you go into depth, you see that by the time we get down to about 1,000 meters or about 3,000 feet roughly, you can see that the volume reduction has been has gone from 750 down to about in the neighborhood of 100 kilograms per cubic meter. So what we've done is we've taken a big volume and we've made it into a smaller volume. And that's really the goal here, is that we take up less pore space. It takes less to handle it. And we can put it into tighter formations. I talked about this earlier, and this goes back to the original question by the representative, was whose definition of security are we talking about? Are we talking about an engineering definition of security? Are we talking about a legal definition of security? So if we inject CO2 into the subsurface, into a sedimentary formation, as we talked to before, the time that CO2 will be down there is going to be on the order of geologic times. And that means that it's going to be down there for as long as the system has integrity and doesn't go through a geologic process of erosion and appearance to the surface. So it's going to be down there for a long time. So if you look at time since we quit injecting CO2 into the subsurface until it's fully mineralized in a sedimentary formation that's predominantly quartz, it's going to be on the order of tens of thousands of years that carbon dioxide is going to be down there as a supercritical fluid. And as geologists, the Earth has done a pretty good job of doing that for a long period of time. It's stored hydrocarbon in the subsurface for millions of years. We're extracting it today, and we extract it all over the state of Wyoming, all over the world. Carbon has been down in the subsurface for a very, very long time. And so the Earth is pretty good at this. And the idea of putting the CO2 back into the ground, that's what's new. It's not new from a societal point of view. We've been doing it in EOR for many, many decades, but from a society, we're not used to doing things the other way. And so associated with anything time we eject something into the subsurface, there's always been associated that it's a waste, that it's dirty, and that it has a negative consequence. The job of us as scientists and engineers is to demonstrate that that negative consequence is minimal and that it doesn't represent a threat to society today, tomorrow, or well into the future. I'm going to skip over that slide there because we talked about that and just go into the summary part. CO2 storage sites should be selected very carefully. They should be selected based on the safety and security of the storage, the capacity and injectivity. If you have a really nice reservoir down there, a really nice rock down there, and you have a nice cap rock, but you can't push carbon dioxide into it because the porosity is too tight, the permeability won't allow it. It isn't a very good site. If you have a perfect site located beneath, not beneath a national park, it's probably not a good idea to go there, just simply because the optics don't work. But there are all sorts of these sites that can be utilized, and the characterization that we've done over the past couple of decades have helped us understand where these sites are. And I will add something here. I know we're talking about carbon sequestration, but the world's going to look different in a decade or 2 decades. Hydrogen is going to become part of the story. And so if we're going to create hydrogen and use it for an energy base, how do we store that hydrogen? We can't build tanks big enough in order to store it for the time period that we're interested in to have grid scale impact. We're going to store it in the subsurface. The information that we've gained from CCS will transfer directly into hydrogen storage. And that's just a little side there, but as we look forward into the billions and billions of dollars being invested on how to produce hydrogen, the ability to capture or to store that hydrogen is going to be every bit as important. Any assessment of CO2 storage capacity should be carefully consider the processes involved, spatial and temporal scales, meaning how are you impacting the neighbor? So if I've leased my pore space, again, I'm not a lawyer, just a geologist, but if you lease my pore space and the neighbor says, well, your pressure is now impacting the ability for me to use my pore space, we have to be able to make sure that we understand those temporal variations and how the system behaves in the subsurface. Sites should be properly characterized. You cannot post-engineer a poorly characterized system. And we look at that at dams, or we look at that at other facilities where we see engineering failures. We need to make sure we do the job right. So we often as a society are more interested in what we can build and how to get it in place. And we forget to spend the amount of time and energy to do the characterization. We're fortunate in CCS is that we've been doing this for 20 years plus. We've been looking at the subsurface and its integrity. And then public perception counts. We talk about this all the time, is that we at Idaho National Laboratory, at other institutions that are doing this, represent an honest broker position. We're happy to talk about some of the difficulties as we have today, and we talk about the benefits of doing carbon sequestration. We have to be able to address the public concerns because they haven't been through the cycles that we've been through. They haven't done the science. And so what we need to be able to be willing to do is not hide some of the issues that may be difficult to address, but rather address them up front and be able to bring the public up to a place where they're comfortable with the actions that are going on and see the benefit in what's going on. And with that, Chairman, I end my presentation and thank you for the opportunity.
Questions? Representative Lawley, watch your questions. The previous one partially cleared the room. So,
Noticed that as well.
yes, I
I
did.
did not intend to call it for bubble.
Okay, so questions. You have committee, you have 2 experts here on the technology of sequestering carbon dioxide. And,
Mr. Chairman?
oh, Representative Western, we don't have you on a screen I can see. I have to turn around to do this. So go ahead.
Appreciate your indulgence, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McLean, my question revolves around kind of the monitoring capabilities and technology, because I think, as you said, we're dealing in geologic times, which are quite long, and the effectiveness really comes down to the integrity of the technology and the infrastructure. So when it comes to the monitoring of this injection, could you maybe touch on just what that technology looked like? How viable is it in terms of its capability and integrity, and as well as this economic feasibility?
Mr. McLean? Doctor?
Mr. Chairman, I'm happy to address that, and then I would like to pass the question on to my colleague, Dr. McLaughlin. He's knows a lot about this. Technology to monitor the subsurface is increasing rapidly. The amount of the ability we have to image the subsurface, the resolution we have in the subsurface. It's quite amazing that we can look at something thousands of meters below the surface and that we can see it down there. The question becomes from if you talk to folks that are concerned about CO2 is that they would say perhaps you need to be able to track molecules or very small portions of the carbon dioxide, and where others would argue that, well, no, we can, if we as long as the error bars are within a certain framework defined by the regulatory agencies, we're well within those bounds. So there's lots of new technology coming on board, a lot of remote sensing, a lot of downhole. We're looking at nanomaterials. We're looking at fiber optic networks that allow us to put fiber networks both on the ground and down in the boreholes that allow us to then have much higher resolution. And the higher the resolution, the greater the certainty that the CO2 is where it's supposed to be. So I answered that question in brief, and I'd like to put Dr. McLaughlin on the spot as well, if that's okay, Mr. Chairman.
Dr. McLaughlin.
Mr. Chairman, Dr. McLean. So there's really two technologies that we employ. One called indirect. Simple as that. Indirect can be things we've already modified from oil and gas, like seismic surveys. I'm sure you're all aware of that. So that's using deep vibrations to characterize the subsurface. And direct are networks of monitoring wells that are necessitated as part of your monitoring plan. The big expenses, roughly, that you asked about come during the injection. So during active injection, there's a lot more monitoring activity. After injection, what we see in real field activity is things stabilize over time. As they stabilize over time and we can prove that, then you're able to walk back your monitoring technologies and expenses. So a lot of the technologies, though there is new burgeoning technology coming out every day, again, we're adapted from typical oil and gas activities. Direct and indirect are the two types of monitoring activities that we employ. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Chairman, follow up.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. McLaughlin, so I guess in a scenario, let's say a leak did happen, from the real time of when a leak started to happen versus when our ability to catch onto it and to be aware of it, what does that time frame look like? And do we have the technology that can sense that pretty quickly? What does that look like?
Dr. McLaughlin.
Mr. Chairman, yeah, absolutely great question. So as part of this whole permitting process, well, we have to develop a large risk strategy and corrective action strategy. So identifying those potential high probability risk zones, maybe it's an old wellbore that exists in the area. So we would then have monitoring technologies dedicated to those highest probability risks. And we would hope to see those in near real time with the monitoring technology, be it usually with the direct method, not the indirect. Again, geology can be fickle. It will be challenging, but that is the level of responsiveness we hope to see in most fields.
Dr. McLean.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd like to address that a little bit further, is that over the past couple of decades, we have spent a lot of time as scientists designing methodologies for monitoring just such activities. And some of those enable us to monitor overlying formations. And we can look at the tracers and natural tracers. These are elements like rare earth elements and other isotopes that exist naturally in the system. And when we see a change in an overlying formation, we have then gone through the process of knowing how to attribute that to a leak, so that it's possible to measure it directly. It's possible to measure that indirectly at a scale that is appropriate for the technology that we're utilizing. So if we're looking at the most likely source, as Dr. McLaughlin said, of leakage would be through a wellbore, but there are also concerns about whether or not you have integrity in the cap rock. And so we do have methodologies. I wish I have a slide deck over here that I could show you on how we've used computational modeling and geochemistry to look at how we can track leakage into overlying aquifers. And remember that when we store CO2, it's down very deep and there's a buffer over the top of that. Even if there were small amounts that were able to leak out of the primary storage formation, that the overlying system is able to buffer and able to accommodate that. If it would be a great opportunity to give you a field tour of a location just near the border of Wyoming and Idaho at Soda Springs, Idaho, where there is large active CO2 leakage. And we have geysers and we have bubbling CO2 charged springs right in the middle of the city of Soda Springs, Idaho. And you could go over there and you could look at what the consequence, and that's in a place where volcanic systems have generated CO2 by roasting the limestone, and it's leaking through a very fractured and faulted network. But it allows us to go in then and measure and evaluate. I published a paper not too long ago just on that site, looking at what that tells us about how to monitor the subsurface for pre-leakage or very early leakage scenarios. And we believe that we have a pretty good methodology for doing that. So thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. McLean, with the storage of CO2 or carbon oxides in over a period of time, the state will become owner of that asset, that resource. But eventually that will become mineralized. What in the future generations, if we desire to extract that carbon again for utilization, will it be more difficult to get that carbon out once it's mineralized than it would be in the gaseous form?
Dr. McLean.
Mr. Chairman, that's another outstanding question. And the answer is that when we talk about that CO2 mineralization time, we're talking about tens of thousands of years. So we're trying to project out into a scenario where human society has never been before. You know, we don't see civilizations lasting that long. So I would say over the time frames that we're interested, many generations, that CO2 is going to be down there and available. And we've often talked about this at our lab, which is at some point, when we finally got a hold of the CO2 problem, that CO2 then becomes a valuable feedstock. And so that we can then go back into the system and recover that CO2 for converting into feedstocks for industrial processes. So the answer is yes, in these sedimentary formations, it will be available for a very long time. In the mafic rocks, the basaltic type rocks I talked about, it's not likely to be available for recovery. That'll be a rapid conversion to mineralization, but that's going to represent a small volume of the total sequestration that happens globally. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Other questions? You've got a couple experts sitting here, and so no, really? Okay. So, but one thing I failed to mention earlier on is why we're doing this. Why are we taking a whole day on carbon dioxide sequestration, utilization? A number of reasons. One, there's money to be made that benefits the state. We benefit our existing industries: coal, oil, gas, electricity production, fertilizer manufacturing, phosphate manufacturing, and that. And we keep those industries going. Whether you believe the whole climate change thing or not is unimportant, but there is money to be made, and it attracts new industries. DEQ will get into some of the companies looking in just terms of numbers at doing this in Wyoming. As they've said, we have great rocks and a great ability to do this. And if you want a number, the last time I looked, industrial grade CO2 was $732 a ton. So for certain grades that they use in industrial processes. So if you want to know what money's to be made, there's money to be made in a variety of ways. So, and we'll talk about that later, but those are the reasons. That's why we're doing this. We have a great opportunity here, and it's up to us to decide whether we want to accept that opportunity or not. Gentlemen, thank you very much, unless there are no more questions. Oh, okay. Representative Tarver.
Thank you, gentlemen, for your presentation. I got I guess a real simple question. I would like to be able to visualize a ton of CO2. So liquid and then gaseous. What kind of space are we talking about? Just curious.
Volunteer. Dr. McLaughlin.
Mr. Chairman, so be happy to send a real figure later, but you're talking a ton of gaseous CO2 about the size of a big RV. Liquefied CO2 gets smaller and smaller depending on density, but you're going down to more of a golf cart. Yeah, and then smaller and smaller, exactly. So, yeah. Mhm.
Gentlemen, thank you very much. So, Mr. Obermuller, I think you have an industry perspective. And just as a reminder, this is kind of introductory stuff, background information. I know you have some other things for us later. You'll be spending most of the day with us. So, and yes. And Dr. McLean, Dr. McLaughlin, if you'd hang with us, because there may be questions that you can answer later. See, and Mr. Obermuller didn't volunteer quick enough. He just got called on. And a reminder on your cell phones, if you had set them to silent, vibrate, whatever, please, for the benefit of everyone here and watching. So, Mr. Obermuller, what's the industry's perspective on the background?
Well, good morning, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee. Pleasure to be here in Kemmerer today. Pete Obermuller, President of the Petroleum Association of Wyoming. Mr. Chairman, if you'll indulge me for 1 second.
Yes.
It relates to why carbon capture, utilization, and storage is important. And it is new data that we just released a couple of days ago with our partners at the American Petroleum Institute. PricewaterhouseCoopers did its annual economic analysis, economic impact of oil and gas across the country, but also in individual states. And pleased to report that the oil and gas industry is back. We have recovered from the downturn related to COVID and the government policies related to dealing with COVID. And in 2021, the direct industry employment in Wyoming is just over 20,000 Wyoming residents work directly in oil and gas. The impact on labor income, that is, of course, payroll in oil and gas, is upwards of $20 billion. And the direct industry impact, the direct GDP in the state of Wyoming is upwards of $8.3 billion, Mr. Chairman. That is, that gets multiplied by a lot when you start taking in indirect and induced, but I like focusing on the direct impact of that. It's the most, it has the best connection, of course. These are the men and women in Wyoming who work in the oil and gas fields, on the pipelines, in the refineries, and what they do to support Wyoming and Wyoming's economy. It's quite remarkable, Mr. Chairman, that direct GDP is a full 20% of Wyoming's total GDP. So why does that matter for this, what we're talking about today? The oil and gas industry has had to innovate for 100 years. We have had to figure out ways to meet environmental requirements. We've had to figure out ways to access resources deep underground in places that we knew there was resource, but we could not find it, could not access it, could not figure out an economic way to recover it. And we've had to take pretty extraordinary steps, and the industry has really led the way in doing that. And carbon capture, utilization, and storage fits right into that. And as has been mentioned before, it's been happening in Wyoming for quite some time. EOR, enhanced oil recovery, is in fact carbon storage, and has it stores the carbon and has the added benefit of producing resources for other uses. That's been happening, as was mentioned, for decades. Not to mention, Mr. Chairman, Many of you took that tour yesterday of the Shoe Creek facility that Exxon operates here in Lincoln County. You heard Commissioner Connolly talk about how proud he was to have that facility here in Lincoln County that has been sequestering carbon for since the 1980s. Meaning that we talked about in that meeting yesterday, the direct employment that happens at that facility. So just a carbon capture facility in and of itself is a major economic driver for a local economy like here in Lincoln County and the surrounding areas. Right now, Mr. Chairman, there are 14 commercial scale capture facilities in the United States that can collectively capture about 21.4 million metric tons per year. The largest one, of course, right here in Lincoln County. But Mr. Chairman, what the International Energy Agency estimates and others estimate we need to capture over the next 10 years, 20 years, 30 years is astronomical. Well over 7 billion tons per year need to be captured to meet carbon capture goals. Now, regardless of what some of us might think about the efficacy of that and the political drive to do that is, as was mentioned, kind of irrelevant. The federal government and the private sector both have decided that this is the direction that makes sense in order to continue our reliance on fossil fuels. So we know, we'll talk more later, as you directed, Mr. Chairman, we'll talk more later about 45Q. I'm happy to talk about that. But we know that the federal government has incentivized it quite a bit. But Mr. Chairman, I also point out that private venture capital, just as one example, in 2015, private venture capital in carbon capture utilization startups was less than 20 million a year. In 2021, that had risen to nearly 240 million a year in private venture capital. So what does that mean to a company like Representative Tarver's and the 400 companies or so in Wyoming whose primary goal, whose only goal is to produce hydrocarbons to meet our energy needs? Mr. Chairman, about a third of Wyoming's oil is produced by companies that individually produce 2% or less of the total oil produced in Wyoming. Nearly 400 companies that collectively produce about a third. They're not doing carbon capture. They're not going to do carbon capture. They are interested in, as you heard from my colleague, Mr. Van Cleef, during the legislative session, they're interested in being in the field and turning the wrenches to get hydrocarbons from the ground. So why does it matter to them? Well, at the end of the day, every single innovation in the oil and gas industry that leads us forward, both in terms of environmental response and in terms of carbon capture and in terms of responding to both government and private sector, helps every single one of Wyoming's natural resource producers do the job that they can do. So the companies like Tallgrass was mentioned before, and Denbury, who you'll hear from later, Occidental, Exxon, many others that have the capital to meet this particular demand, whether the demand is government induced or private induced or both, have the ability to meet this demand, allows the third of Wyoming's resources that is produced every year in Wyoming to continue to do so without having to take on that resource or that effort that the larger companies can do. So it is, at the end of the day, what this economic impact from the oil and gas industry, these innovations are what allow us to move forward. And the small operators, the ones that I spent a lot of time talking to, and I talk to them a lot because they don't have geologists working for them. They don't have government affairs people working for them. They're out in the fields. And so I have to reach out to them to talk to them about what's going on. And they're a lot of times very surprised to hear about the litigation and those sorts of things. But I talk to them about this. And to a T, some of them may be very skeptical about the need for carbon capture. But they recognize two things. It's already been happening in EOR for decades. It's already been happening in Lincoln County for decades. And they recognize that that it allows them to go do the work they want to do. And that's produced for Wyoming and for America. So, Mr. Chairman, I'm excited about it. I'm glad there are companies that want to step to the plate. At PAW, we've formed a separate group, Carbon Management Innovations Group, made up of companies within PAW and open to companies outside of PAW that are interested in carbon management and innovations in carbon management. Because at the end of the day, as many studies have pointed out about the so-called Inflation Reduction Act that the Congress passed last year, it is not the mandates in the Inflation Reduction Act that are going to move the needle on carbon capture. It's the incentives, it's the carrots, it's not the sticks. And so there's a lot of folks who are interested in that, and you will hear more about that moving forward. So, Mr. Chairman, that's my spiel about why it matters, and happy to take questions. We'll get into the details of some suggestions we have that Wyoming can do to make it even better here in Wyoming. We'll get to that later.
Thank you, Mr. Obermiller. Any questions? Any questions for Mr. Obermiller on the industry perspective? So, hey, Mr. Obermiller, is it fair to say that the members of your organization, the oil and gas industry, are the ones who really have the skills, ability, technology to drill these wells, the injection wells, to set up the facilities, to do that injection, and it comes with all your many years of experience?
Mr. Chairman, absolutely. And it's proven, as I mentioned before, it's proven over and over again over the last 100 years. It's really the industry that does the production, not just in oil and gas, but looking at Representative Conrad and thinking about the technology advancements at the Trona facilities, and it is the industry that spends the time and the resources and the effort to make these advancements, and they're only going to happen if if industry is involved. Now, government can step in and help make that kind of investment economical, and you heard that already, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. But government cannot do it by itself. In fact, they're not well suited to do it. Industry has the expertise and the ability.
So, Mr. Obermiller, then with all the years that the industry has been doing enhanced oil recovery with CO2, generally, when you do that, about how much of the CO2 remains in the formation? How much of it comes back? I know some of the companies recycle the excess CO2 to re-inject it again, so they don't have to buy as much, because they have to. Most people don't realize they're paying for that CO2 that they buy from, say, Exxon here to use in the Bear Oil field or other fields. They actually pay a price for that CO2.
Right.
So they do clean it, recirculate, but about how much stays in the ground on an average?
Mr. Chairman, I'm going to defer that question because there are experts in the room on this who do this every day. And I think later when we start talking about EOR and in particular, there'll be folks who can talk about that in greater detail. I will tell you, that currently Wyoming already injects about 15,000 metric tons of carbon for EOR purposes daily.
Thank you. So for the experts in the field that will answer that question later, write that one down. So I'll let you hold that. Anything else from Mr. Obermiller? Any other questions?
Mr. Chairman.
Oh, yes, Representative Western. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr.
Go ahead,
Chairman.
proceed.
Thank you. Mr. Obermiller, I ask a question more about the economics of CO2 injection, because I think if you look at our agenda for today and you look at the folks who are testifying, there's a lot of technical knowledge out there that we've got on the agenda, folks who know the science, the technology, all that stuff. But I was wondering more on the economic component of it in terms of what are the market forces that are driving this, and how is it economical for some of these folks? Where is this demand coming from, and how is it making the business model economically viable for some of these companies? I know that's quite a broad question, but maybe if you could kind of just touch on that business model and the economics of it.
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Obermiller.
Representative Western, are you referring to storage, permanent storage, or enhanced oil recovery, or both?
Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. More so just the storage component, but you're welcome to touch on both.
Mr. Obermiller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Representative Western. the economics, I think you heard about it earlier a little bit. The economics of permanent storage changed significantly with the passage of the so-called Inflation Reduction Act. The 45Q tax credit at $85 a ton for permanent storage is a game changer. And we often talk about in terms of what AW would try to work on at the state level. What should we ask of you all that would actually move the needle on economic activity in Wyoming? We want to spend time on those things. Well, let me tell you, Mr. Chairman, Representative Western, that $85 a ton tax credit at the federal level moves that needle. And you can see that by the activity just here in Wyoming. We have great storage sites. We have great regulatory structure. We have legislation in place. In some cases, it's been there for more than a decade. We have primacy. We are way ahead of the game in terms of our regulatory and legislative structure, which is amazing. And we're going to ask for a couple of changes there to stay ahead of the game later on. That's all great. But you see all this activity from all of the players in Wyoming and in other states, quite frankly, because of that tax credit at the federal level. And I talk about that at storage because you heard already that's $85 a ton. Enhanced oil recovery is at $60 a ton, and that does not quite move the needle on enhanced oil recovery.
Follow up, Representative Western?
Not at this time. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Okay, any other questions for Mr. Obermueller? Questions? Okay. Mr. Obermueller, thank you. And I'm not the slave driver I may appear, so we'll take a 15-minute break before we get into the departments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the opportunity for introductions.
Thank you.
Testing 1, 2, testing. Testing 1, 2, testing. Testing 1, 2, testing, testing.
Heather, are we back live? Okay, we're back live. Okay, and a reminder to Mr. Luthi. Thank you. Okay, we will get going again. So where are our directors? Director Parfit, Director Kropatch? It's your show for the next 3 hours. Please. So gentlemen, I'll let you decide who wants to go first. I've seen Tom's presentation, Director Kropatch's presentation. And I think he has summarized an awful lot of the statutes, how they work and that sort of thing. So Director Parfit, I think if it's okay with you, we'll let him go first. And this will cover a lot of the current statutes, how things work, where they need to go and maybe improve. One thing I will say for the public, there will be opportunity for public comment, but right now we're doing mostly informational to set the stage and the basis for those issues. We will work as a committee. So with that, Director Kropatch, please proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the record, my name is Tom Kropatch. I'm the Oil and Gas Supervisor for the Oil and Gas Commission in the state of Wyoming. My presentation today.
Tom, you may need to move that mic just a little bit. There you go. Thank you, because
Mr. Chairman.
the people in the virtual realm need to be able to hear us. Thank you.
So as you stated, Mr. Chairman, my presentation will be focused on the Oil and Gas Commission's role in CO2 injection and sequestration. Some information briefly as it relates to enhanced oil recovery, and also areas where there's other overlap between the Oil and Gas Commission or the oil and gas industry more broadly and sequestration and CCS projects. And then I'll jump in a little bit into the statutes, into pore space, into unitization of the pore space, and some of the complexities related to that process. And really with the goal of first of all, providing a good understanding of CO2 injection from an oil and gas perspective, but maybe more importantly, better understanding unitization, pore space, why unitization is necessary for CCS, how it's done, and also some of the questions that are out there in the current statutes or some of the complexities that current statutes bring to that process.
So, Director, thank you. I will say for the people watching in the virtual realm and the people in the room at this point, we probably will not directly follow the agenda, mainly because there's no way to do this in a linear manner. We're going to jump around a little bit. You'll hear some repetition and that sort of thing, but we need to cover all of these topics and how they interweave and affect the state and our businesses. So again, Director, proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And so with all that said, I will start off saying that the commission has not yet heard its first unitization matter for pore space unitization. So, you know, some of these questions are hypothetical or things that we have out there that will be worked through at the commission, you know, when the first application does arrive, probably not too far in the distant future. But maybe before jumping into those details, just since I haven't presented in front of this committee with some of the new members yet, and just a little bit of background on Oil and Gas Commission itself, just for a minute or so. Wyoming statutes 30-5-101 through 128, known as the Wyoming Oil and Gas Conservation Act, created the commission in 1951. Our commission is made up of the governor, the director of Office of State Lands and Investments, the state geologist, and then two members from the public at large who are qualified to represent the oil and gas industry. So we have a petroleum engineer and a petroleum geologist right now. We meet the second Tuesday of every month in Casper, and public is welcome to attend those hearings and those matters. Those statutes also created the position of the state oil and gas supervisor to help the commission carry out its duties and orders and rules and regulations. And then it also created the agency staff also to support the commission and the supervisor in carrying out their duties. So we're authorized for 41 full-time employees. Right now we have 6 positions that are open at our agency. Next slide, please. Those statutes grant quite a few authorities to the commission. Those are listed up there. Our main duties are to prevent waste of the oil and gas resource, protect relative rights of the mineral owners, protect freshwater zones. We can charge fees for certain things. We can ask for bonds. We have regulatory authority and interesting matter over oil mining, of which there is one oil mine within the state of Wyoming, and we can talk on the side about that. But we also, and more pertinent to today, establish drilling units and create other types of unitization for water floods and enhanced oil recovery. So on the 4th slide there, moving into oil and gas and its CO2 injection relationship. Obviously, as been mentioned today, we would inject oil and get CO2 for either enhanced oil recovery or sequestration. In 2022, there were 5 fields in Wyoming that received CO2 injection. Those are listed there on the slide. That is permitted through the Oil and Gas Commission as a Class 2 UIC injection well. So the Oil and Gas Commission has primacy for Class 2 wells, which are wells that are either related to injection for increased production or disposal of oil and exploration and production waste. So we have two subclasses of disposal and injection of the Class 2. And so obviously DEQ has primacy for Class 6. They would permit the Class 6 wells, but there is some overlap on those. You could start what a project could start its life as a Class 2 project, recovering oil and gas from a field, and for a couple different reasons be required to transition to a Class 6 permit. You could just see, it could be the end of the life of the oil and gas field. The oil production is no longer economic, and the operator wishes to just transition over to permanent carbon sequestration, and they could permit that as a Class 6 well. The other scenario is if the primary reason becomes sequestration. You could still be recovering oil and gas, but if it makes an increased risk to the USDW, then you could be required to transition to Class 6 and the additional requirements there. And with that process, as detailed a little bit, there's a process that an operator would be able to come into the commission and have a review of that. They could make the claim that there really is no increased risk. The commission could weigh in on that because obviously there is increased cost and increased technical complexity of operating a Class 6 program versus a Class 2 program. And so an operator may say, it's not worth it to me. I'm not really increasing this risk. If I have to transition, I'm just going to shut the project down. So they get their due process in that review by coming into the commission for that. Next slide, slide 5. The commission's involvement more now in CCS. Wyoming statutes 3511, 314 through 317 authorize unitization of geologic sequestration sites. The statutory purpose for that is to protect corresponding rights, compliance with environmental requirements, and to facilitate the use and production of Wyoming's energy resources. And it provides the Oil and Gas Commission the authority to do that unitization. That authority is also found in Wyoming Statute 30-5-104, which is part of the Conservation Act. And so maybe a little bit outside the Class 6 or Class 2 realm and enhanced recovery and just other areas where there's overlap between Class 2 and Class 6. One, if that conversion were to ever occur. Another factor for that would be in these Class 6 projects, DEQ is required to do an area of review where they look at all of the existing penetrations of the injection zone and make sure there aren't migratory pathways for those for that CO2 to migrate outside its intended zone. Many times, and in many cases, it'll be common that there'll be oil and gas wells that either exist in that injection zone, drilled through it or drilled to it. Maybe they still exist, maybe they're plugged back or plugged and abandoned. And so DEQ would be required to look at those wells. Oil and Gas Commission staff would assist with that, with our expertise on those wells and the well construction and the data as of the data repository for that type of well. We'd provide assistance and work with the oil and gas operator potentially for access to those wells so that the Class 6 could move forward and the wells could have potentially remedial work done to no longer be a concern for the area of review. The next slide, and it was mentioned briefly, maybe in Dr. McLaughlin's talk this morning, but if that intended CO2 injection formation is oil and gas bearing, then the commission would need to be involved in that because we would need to make sure that there isn't a violation of the Conservation Act. For example, if you inject the CO2 and have no plans to produce the oil or gas, does that harm anybody? Does it push oil off the lease? And does that then violate correlative rights? Does that harm that mineral owner by then having the oil not on their property anymore, or not part of their property anymore? So,
Director, I'll interrupt you there and ask the committee, are there any questions? And I would ask you to ask your questions as they come up. As the director mentioned, correlative rights. I know all of you know what those are, so nobody asked a question. So, but if you don't understand anything, please ask at the time. Thank you. Proceed.
Mr. Chairman, and that's a good point to make, and I'll define correlative rights because it is a little bit related to Class 6 with a different term where they use corresponding rights, and essentially it's a similar thing, but the correlative rights is just the ability for the mineral owner to have the right to produce their minerals. So if I own a piece of property or if I own minerals in a certain portion of lands, and it just really is my ability to produce those minerals. And I mentioned if we're injecting CO2, obviously for enhanced recovery, CO2 likes to move oil. We're injecting that and we're moving oil ahead of the Class 6 sequestration plume, and it moves it off my property. Now my correlative rights potentially have been harmed because I may not have access to the oil, to the minerals that were mine to begin with. And so we'd need to, as a commission's duty to protect correlative rights, we would need to examine that and make sure that those owners aren't being harmed in that process.
Senator Rothfuss.
I think it's also important to note that the pore space ownership is different from the mineral ownership. And so that scenario that you lay out is a realistic financial motivation where I may own the pore space, but not the minerals. I may want to do an injection, and then I would effectively be moving the oil off of the mineral estate that is within my pore space. I would have a financial gain from that. And since it's not my mineral asset, I have no financial loss associated with moving the mineral estate. So I'm sure that hasn't happened yet, but is that something that you feel is sufficiently contemplated by statute at this point in time? Or is that something that we may need more statute associated with? How do we feel we have that handled?
Director.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, I think we have adequate statutory authority to examine that issue. The commission is directed to protect correlative rights. Where the conflict comes in, and we'll talk about it a little bit more in another slide or two, but where the conflict comes in is how do we handle that issue? That they may be different parties. Somebody may be doing a Class 6 project, don't care about the minerals at all. The commission does and is required to protect those by statute, those correlative rights. And so, I think there needs to be discussion of how we would handle that process. And maybe this ties into some of the conversation that Mr. Obermueller mentioned earlier, but the enhanced recovery process should be incentivized, I think, in that scenario, that we need to look at first producing the oil and gas with the CO2 injection, because there's a value to that, and the state gets a value out of the production of the oil and gas along with the mineral owners. And so I think there's a process and a way forward. I don't think it's been contemplated too much because the current projects and processes don't have that impact yet. But I think eventually, as the industry takes off, we'll probably have that conflict before too long. And so we'll need to understand how we're going to manage that. And hopefully the potential incentives or the desire to produce the minerals and do enhanced recovery first would be what the project proponent is proposing, and then a longer term switch over to the class 6 as the enhanced recovery starts to become less economic.
Proceed.
And so, Mr. Chairman, on the bottom of slide 6 there, just to that point, the mineral owner, pore space owner may be different entities. Access to the pore space doesn't mean you have a right to impact the minerals. And in statute, the minerals do remain dominant over the pore space, just as they are dominant over the surface. And so next slide, and jumping in maybe a little further to
Director, just to clarify for the committee, that requirement that mineral state has primacy over surface, and that is a federal, that originally came out of the federal regulations, correct?
Mr. Chairman, I'm not sure if it has or not, but it is in the state, in the split of state statutes of the state. So I think in most cases, in most states, that is the same scenario. So
Stat, Brian?
Yep, Mr. Chairman, generally property law is a matter of state law.
Okay,
So
Thank
that
you.
I think would originate with us. Yeah.
okay. Thank you. Thanks for the clarification. Proceed.
So, Mr. Chairman, jumping into pore space, and some of the stuff I'll skip over or go through very quickly because it has been mentioned by other presenters already today. But pore space ownership and definition is found in Wyoming Statute 34-1-152, and the statutes just define it as the subsurface space, which can be used as storage space for carbon dioxide or other substances. The statute says that the owners of the surface above the strata or the owners of the surface own the pore space. It can be conveyed. It's conveyed typically, the statutes indicate that it's conveyed with the surface unless it's explicitly excluded from that conveyance. So if I sell my surface property, if I specifically exclude the pore space, I can keep it or give it to, sell it to someone else. But unless it's specifically excluded, then it's just automatically conveyed along with the surface. It can also be conveyed in a manner provided by law for the transfer of minerals. So you could sign leases, you could do however you can transfer minerals, you can also transfer your pore space. So we could have split the state pore space as well. The surface owner could be different than the pore space owner, which could be different from the mineral owner as well.
Yes, Senator Ellis.
Thank you. Can you walk us through then the primacy when you have that, or the dominant versus the Serbian estate, when you have a new, more or less estate? And it's pretty easy to start thinking of scenarios where you might have a surface owner who no longer has their pore space, and then a mineral estate interest as well. It gets really tricky when you have three. Can you walk us through how that, who is the senior rights on some of those?
Director.
Mr. Chairman and Senator Ellis, it can and probably will get fairly complicated. We see those issues on just within the mineral estate itself being complicated in many scenarios. I think, and I'm not an attorney, as it's been stated earlier, I'm a rock looker as well, just a geologist. So we'd have to bring in our attorneys, but the mineral estate is dominant over both the surface and the pore space. So I think that they take the precedent, if they need access to the surface or the pore space to produce their minerals, then I think that they'd have the dominance there. And we'll discuss in more detail as we go through, but the pore space owner is not dominant to the surface. Nothing gives the right for a pore space owner, for example, to use the surface if they don't already have those rights existing somewhere else. So they would essentially need a surface use agreement or some access with the surface owner to be able to utilize the pore space. And part of that process is through unitization, and we'll discuss that as we go through my presentation. But there's still some direction within those statutes that would talk about use of the surface above the pore space. Slide 8, we can move to. So we've mentioned unitization a little bit. Unitization is a common term in the oil and gas industry. And so, there's various definitions out there. I've thrown one up on the screen on that slide. It really is just combining separately owned mineral leasehold interests related to common supply, such as a reservoir or a field, to create a joint operation to maximize production and optimize operations. So in kind of trying to convert that into what would it mean for pore space, really what we're doing in unitization of pore space is combining separate pore space ownership or leasehold interests into a common area, such as your CO2 injection plume, to to optimize the operations of your sequestration project, maximize the injection into that pore space so that we're efficiently using the pore space in the project. Why would we unitize? Why would we need to do something like that? Mainly because the operator in certain cases without unitization would not have access to utilize the pore space for their injection project. If you don't have a lease or ownership of the pore space, then you have no right to use that property. So unitization provides that process to be able to use that pore space, even if you don't have a lease or an ownership interest in it. And we'll describe how that works and what considerations the pore space owners are given in the process. And a secondary reason is once the commission enters an order for unitization, the statutes provide exclusive operatorship of that unit area to the unit operator or their parties that are identified in their plan of operations within the unitization application and order. And so in the end, what it allows is exclusive right to use that pore space once you have the unit created and formed and the commission's order is valid. And I'll talk more about that in a little bit as well. So moving on to slide 9. Why the commission? You may ask, DEQ has authority for class 6. Why don't they just unitize or some other agency? And this statute was first implemented in 2009. So a little before my time, just about a year or so before my time in the commission. So I wasn't involved in those discussions, but I think a couple of reasons as I think about why is the commission the one tasked or authorized with doing that? And number one, as I stated, the commission already has that process in place for oil and gas. We've have a 70-year history of unitizing oil and gas fields. And so well experienced with doing that. Unitization and the commission process provides due process to the pore space owners to have their say. So the unitization can only take place after notice and hearing to all the owners. They're allowed to come in and provide testimony or evidence if they have something that they would disagree with the operator on. And so a contested case like that has a process. It's an appropriate venue for that type of contested case within the state to be able to do that type of process. And so the commission, with their expertise, can hear and does hear on a monthly basis geologic and engineering testimony related to these types of issues. They're well versed in that process, and they have the technical knowledge within the commission to be able to hear that testimony and discern between contested cases or between protesting parties where that goes. And also there's the commission has a process to be able to do an executive session if there's business confidential information, financial information, or other geologic data, such as seismic data and other things that can be by statute be held confidential. So they can do that in an executive session and still allow the parties to have their say in front of the commission. And so on to slide 10. And so more into unitization, and again, the statutory purposes: protection of corresponding rights, compliance with environmental requirements, and facilitate the use and production of energy resources. That's the statutory reasons why we would unitize. And so corresponding rights I mentioned is somewhat equivalent, I think, to correlative rights. And in this case, it's just the right of all the pore space owners in the unit area who would be affected by those operations, either now or in the future, to concurrently share in the economic benefits generated by the pore space use in the unit area. And so what that really means is if I own pore space on the outside edge of a CO2 plume and someone starts injecting today, but the CO2 plume isn't going to migrate onto my pore space for 10 years, I would still get to share immediately within that in the benefit of the pore space usage. And so from the beginning, the person next to the injection well gets the CO2 today, it doesn't hit my property till sometime in the future. We all share concurrently immediately in that benefit. Compliance with the environmental requirements. When this was written, class 6 program didn't even exist. And so I think this was the term used to just say that unit operations are conducted in accordance with what is now the DEQ class 6 permit requirements to ensure that unit operations and costs are in line with required compliance economic benefits to the pore space owners are maximized and facilitate the use and production of Wyoming energy resources. By combining the pore space leasehold interests and allowing access to pore space for injection of CO2 and offsetting CO2 emissions, then we're, facilitating that use of the Wyoming energy resources by being able to use this pore space and combine it into a large enough area to be able to actually inject and sequester the CO2 in Wyoming. Next slide, please, 11. And so I think before we maybe go further, it's important to understand that unitization of pore space is not the same as compulsory pooling or pooling or forced pooling, which is found in Wyoming Statute 30-5-109. The pore space unitization is really similar to our water flood and enhanced recovery operations, and we'll get a little bit more into that. Forced pooling, compulsory pooling, which is what we normally call it, compulsory pooling, really is a process set up to allow the combination of mineral interests to drill a well. So we think of, today horizontal wells, 2-mile laterals, 1,280 acre drilling and spacing unit. And really what we're doing is combining interests within that unit so that a well can be drilled and efficiently drain that acreage. Compulsory pooling does allow risk penalties and other penalties to be assigned, cost recovery to be assigned to operator or to working interests who don't voluntarily join in that pool. And so commonly a working interest may be penalized up to 300%, for example, for certain costs if they don't voluntarily join and pay their share of the cost of the well. So if the operator has to carry everyone else, then they get a risk penalty and some cost recovery. The unitization does not have that process. It does not have, the statutes don't allow for risk penalties or anything associated with the unitization. And it's really a much larger area typically. Instead of 1,280 acres, maybe we're talking about tens of thousands of acres. In the oil and gas sense, unitization is talking about, an entire pool or an entire field that can be combined into one operator for, optimizing operations and injection of water or CO2 or something else. So we're really talking about large scale operations. Unitization requires sign up of 80% of the owners in the unit area versus pooling. Compulsory pooling just requires that one person own an interest, and if everybody else doesn't voluntarily join, they can still force them into the unit, into the drilling and spacing unit. So and I think maybe related to the cost recovery, in issuing an order for unitization, the commission would have to find that all the owners portion, all their allocation of the economic benefits is fair and reasonable between all parties. So even in the case of unitization, even if you don't join voluntarily, not only are there no risk penalties, but you're considered the same as any other owner. So your share of the economic benefit has to be fair and equitable. You can't be penalized for not joining and take a reduced share or something like that. Everybody's getting a fair and equitable share of the economic benefit. And so that I think moves us into what is required for a unitization application in front of the commission. That's statute 3511-315. The statutes indicate that really any interested party can file that application. We typically think that it's going to be the unit operator or the sequesterer of the carbon, but it doesn't have to be. Could be a pore space owner that says, someone's approaching me and wants to inject CO2. They could apply for unitization.
Representative Conrad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Quick question for you. Can you walk back at least a little for me, the 80% rule again? I didn't fully understand that.
Sure. Mr. Chairman. Director. Representative Conrad, and we'll get into a little more detail in the slides here, but within the unitization application, they have to have the party that's applying, or for the commission to be able to issue an order and the order to become effective, 80% of the pore space owners, well, I should say it this way, owners representing 80% of the pore space within the unit have to voluntarily agree to unitization and to the plan of operations. So the commission order does not become effective until at least the owners representing 80% of the pore space agree to that unitization. And so you could force the other 20% in, similar to how compulsory pooling works. But for those 20% of the owners, they don't take a risk penalty or have any cost sharing or anything that would be any different than the 80% who already signed up.
Follow up.
Thank you, Chairman. So did the 20% benefit any monetary component of that?
Director?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Conrad, they would get the same economic benefit that the 80% gets essentially, or a fair and equitable share. And we'll get into more of how the economic benefits work, because that is the complex part of this unitization. And the way the statutes work right now is the consideration of economic benefits and how they're allocated, how costs are considered. And it's a complex issue in the oil and gas sense, and the way the statutes are written make it even more complex in the pore space world. And so I'll walk through that and hopefully that'll clear some up. And if not, we'll take more questions on that.
So, and committee, one reason to get a good grasp of this is there will be a recommendation for changes in these statutes to clarify some of these issues. So that's why the detail on this.
So, Mr. Chairman, so again, any interested party can file that application with the commission. The application does have certain requirements that they need to comply with to be able to file the application or to include within the application. The first couple of those are fairly simple, just a copy of the permit or a draft permit, or even a copy of the application that's submitted to DEQ for the Class 6 operations, and a description of the unit area. And in reality, that unit area description is going to be based on the Class 6 permit or the application to DEQ if they haven't issued a draft permit or a permit yet. And really, that's based on the modeling that they're going to show where the CO2 is going to migrate to, how big the plume size is going to get. Because again, they have to have access to the pore space to be able to, so wherever their CO2 is going, they have to have access to that pore space. And so that needs to essentially be, the unit size can be no smaller than that. It could be bigger than where the CO2 plume migrates to, but it couldn't be smaller if the CO2 plume migrated outside. Then they wouldn't have access to that pore space. And again, this really is related to where they don't have access, where they already don't have 100% leased up or something like that.
Senator Office.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I know we haven't really, I think, done a lot of this yet, but I'm curious how it ends up working with regard to the required size of unitization. If I have an expectation that a certain amount of CO2, and we'll say the CO2 that will be used for the project is going to be in some portion of the zone, and I've got some vertical differentiation in it. So I've got the likelihood of, we'll say, the CO2 plume ending up on the east half arbitrarily, and that it'll only be water on the west half. But I'm now pressurizing that reservoir, and I'm effectively affecting everybody. The west half is affected also, but the CO2 will remain on the east half. So it's geologically a unit, but I'm not having the CO2 reside in half of the space. I'm only having it reside in the other half. So do I unitize the entirety because it's all fluidically required for the CO2 to be where it's at? Or do I only unitize the space where the CO2 is going to long-term reside? And have we worked that out?
Director?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, that's one of the complexities of this process, I think. So you could make three different arguments there. You could say we're only going to unitize the CO2 plume and where the CO2 goes, because that's what, as the sequestration project, that's what's being injected, and that's what they're using the pore space for, right? And so there could be a second idea there that the material that was in that pore space to begin with, you have to push out of the way to get the CO2 in. So let's just say it's water. So where that water goes then is where maybe you'd have to provide the unit And then maybe even a more complex issue is not just water, but now there's a pressure front beyond that that is in my pore space now. You know, my pore space is pressured up. And that's really what should be unitized. That hasn't been answered yet. You know, I think we have our own ideas, and I think where we're headed with the commission is that the CO2 plume and what we're placing into the pore space is what needs to be unitized. You know, the water is there. It just got moved.
Follow up, please.
Follow up on that. And that makes sense so long as the pressure doesn't change. But if you have a cap pressure for the reservoir that you can inject to, then if you've changed my pressure of my reservoir to the point where I could no longer do any injection in my pore space as a result of the injection in the other pore space, then you've fundamentally affected the value of my asset. And from that standpoint, it might not always be the right answer. The other thing that I'm curious about is effectively the concept of trespassing through my pore space, which is probably not anything we've spent a lot of time thinking about. But if you are flowing water through my pore space, do I have a right to the fact that I want to exclude you from trespass on my pore space? And with all of the hypotheticals and things that we get into in surface estate trespass and you know, how high does our estate go? There might be questions there too that need to be looked at. I realize none of this has come up yet, but all hypotheticals we should probably work through before they end up in courts to the greatest degree we can.
Mr. Chairman.
Director, we've seen to it that you get the easy questions.
Mr. Chairman, I will just respond that we have been thinking about that a lot. I don't know that we've come up with any great answers, and you know, it may be in the end, it may be the courts that have to decide what does need to be unitized, because that question has been out there, and we can go back and forth on a lot of different options and why they should be appropriate, and so while we're thinking about it, I don't know that we've made great progress as to the best answer for those three.
Representative Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Kind of while we're on the subject, is it possible though that there are some other options to compensate in these areas of some of these different hypotheticals that don't really necessarily fit in the unitization model, but are other things that could be developed to address some of those issues outside of unitization?
Director.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Lawley, I think you're correct. And you know, maybe it's as simple as that operator understands those conditions and goes out and provides leases. So they lease that pore space, even though it may not be part of the unit itself, they're giving them some compensation. You know, that also has maybe some other benefits as it relates to a Class 6 project to essentially just put it as we would in oil and gas, to tie up that acreage so that so that someone else can't permit an injection well in there, for example, which would then, you know, maybe have an impact on the existing project and where that plume migrates to. So there's considerations for that I think are out there as well.
Thank you.
Proceed.
Mr. Chairman, we're on slide 12 of my presentation, just to make sure we're all on the same page at the top there. The application must include notice to those parties who own an interest in the surface estate and pore space within the unit area. And that includes mortgages or liens or other encumbrances. So all those parties would get notice or would be listed in the application. And also, and maybe back to some of this discussion that we just had, but names of the owners of the surface and pore space also immediately adjoining, but not within the unit. So the parties that are essentially left outside the unit boundaries also are included in that application, and as part of the hearing process would get notice of the hearing and opportunity to come to the commission. And so then in the application, we also need a proposed plan of unitization. And that's what the applicant considers fair, reasonable, and equitable, including provisions for determining the pore space to be used in the unit, appointment of the unit operator, and then at a time when that plan becomes effective. The plan also needs to include how they're going to determine the pore space storage capacity for each of the separately owned tracts, and the formula or method by which the pore space owners and storage capacity will be allocated that economic benefit that's generated by use of the pore space. And I'll provide some more details as we talk about complexities in this process in a couple slides. So on slide 13, then, finally, the plan needs to include the method for generating economic benefits within the pore space unit area. And it needs to include a unit operations plan unless all pore space owners have already agreed to that plan, then it wouldn't need to, then the commission wouldn't need to see what the plan is. But that plan, that unit operations would be, how is the unit going to be supervised and managed? How are costs allocated and paid? It makes a little more sense in the oil and gas world when we talk about that type of plan, because we talk about, certain operators brought in, these wells with this equipment on it, and so the new unit operator is gonna pay them at whatever condition that equipment is currently in. We're gonna assign allocation of original oil in place and recovery of that and the incremental production. And within the unitization world, that starts to get more complicated, and we'll get into that as we go into the next slide or two.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you. So on the pore space unitization and overall the pore space ownership concepts, we were obviously either first or second in the country to put forward this legislation. It's been on the books for quite a while. Have all of the other states gone with the same approach to surface ownership, surface estate ownership, owning the pore space, or is there differentiation among the states? I don't think I've ever looked into that before to know whether other states are doing it differently.
Director, Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, North Dakota has the same process. As far as I'm aware, most states are looking at the same surface owner being the owner of the pore space, but not everyone. And in what's more common is that some states just haven't addressed it yet in statute, and they're looking at it. But as far as I'm aware, in the states that I've talked to, and the states that I'm aware of what they have, they are doing surface owner as the pore space owner. In some states, I think they're also considering the mineral owner would be the other alternative really that I've heard is the mineral owner is also the pore space owner.
Follow up.
Is there any significant state that, and I don't mean some states are insignificant, but in terms of significant mineral producers that has opted for that? I don't know of any, but that was kind of what I was getting at is there a leading producing state that actually has the mineral estate owner being the pore space owner as well?
Director, Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, I'm not sure that any state has made it to where it's official in statute, but that's the way it's headed. And I can follow up with you on that. I think there might be a state, but I don't want to say it if it's not, if they haven't finished it off yet. So I'll follow up with you on that.
Proceed.
So Mr. Chairman, on the bottom of slide 13, we start jumping into what the commission would need to do once they receive the application, and then how the commission would enter an order and what they need to find to be able to enter an order for unitization. So once the commission receives that order, the statute directs us to set that matter for a hearing. We'll require that the applicant provide notice to all those owners that are listed in the application inside and outside of the unit, surface and pore space owners. And then they would hold that hearing. After the hearing, the commission should enter an order for unitization if they can find some of the following items. Number one, that the purpose is listed, and then that was the corresponding rights, environmental requirements, and facilitate energy use, Wyoming's energy use. If we can find that those purposes will be served by granting the application. A couple of the big ones, the quantity of pore space storage capacity and method used to determine quantity of pore space storage capacity allocated to each of the separately owned tracts represents each tract's actual share of the pore space to be used. I'll get into more details of that kind of little bit confusing statement there in a minute. Also, that the method by which the allocation of economic benefits generated from use of the pore space between pore space owners and unit operator or others is fair and reasonable. And this next statement really brings in complexity into this process, but taking into consideration the costs required to capture, transport, and sequester the carbon dioxide. And then lastly, that they need to find that the method of generating economic benefits from the use of pore space in the unit area is fair and equitable, And again, this next statement also brings in some complexity and is reasonably designed to maximize the value of such use. So the value of use of the pore space and maximizing that. And then just some other things that the commission's order or the commission needs to have before they can enter the order. Again, it doesn't become effective until at least the owners representing at least 80% of the pore space within the unit area is signed up. That can be sometimes difficult. And so the statute does have a provision to reduce that amount to 75% sign up. If negotiations have occurred for a period of 9 months and you're still not at the 80% limit for sign up. So again, in that scenario, one party may have 50% of the pore space storage capacity. Another party may have 30% of the pore space storage capacity. And then there may be 10 people that own the last 20%. If those 2 people sign up, those other 10 people can be unitized. So it's really based on the pore space storage capacity and not necessarily, acreage, surface acreage or something like that. And we'll talk more about pore space storage capacity here in a minute and some of the factors that go into that consideration and how it could be different than surface acreage.
I thought I saw a question. No, okay. Director, quickly, how do you determine pore space capacity?
So pore space storage capacity is based on several mostly geologic factors such as porosity, permeability, thickness of the formation. We make, a term that used in oil and gas, net pay. And so we would look at that and, you could imagine a scenario where on one side of the unit, the injection formation is, 100 feet thick with good porosity and good permeability. And as you travel in one direction or the other, that formation starts to thin and maybe porosity is less or permeability is less. And so the owners in that one side with more thickness of formation, better porosity, would be assigned a larger pore space storage capacity than the owner who has less formation present and, under their surface or in their pore space, or maybe less porosity or less permeability within their pore space. And so that it can, it would hold less CO2 in that portion of the unit. And so those owners who have a higher pore space storage capacity would then be allocated a higher portion of the total share of the unit and the economic benefits. In some cases, either the unit may be small enough or maybe the geology is homogeneous enough that you could just use a proxy like surface acreage to determine the pore space storage capacity allocation. So you could just say, well, if someone has half of the surface acreage, they get half of the pore space storage capacity. So whichever method, and there could be, various methods that a unit operator suggests to the commission is appropriate, they would have to justify that option or that whichever method they're going to use in front of the commission using geologic and engineering testimony to show why surface acreage would be a good proxy versus having to go into the detail of signing and looking at, detailed thicknesses and things like that of the formation. So the one project I'm aware of in North Dakota that they've kicked off so far and is operating, they did use surface acreage in their unitization process as a proxy for that project. And it's not a large area. So it in some of those cases, that probably will be what occurs in Wyoming as well. And especially in a smaller unit.
Representative Rothfuss, or I'm sorry, Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr.
Excuse
Chairman.
me.
I'm thinking about the rigorous standards we have for applying for a Class 6 injection well, as an example. If you achieved those standards of modeling and understanding of the reservoir to get to a Class 6 injection well, I don't understand why you would ever need a proxy. I mean, you should have that so well characterized at that point that you could slice down from above and you could calculate the pore volume of every slice that you have and should be able to just directly provide this is the pore space for this surface estate owner and the associated porosity. So, well, I guess in North Dakota, it probably wasn't a Class 6 well, it was probably Class 2 or?
It was a Class 6 well.
It was a Class 6 well and they did that anyway. So then I guess my question is why?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, I think if you consider a unit that could get significantly large in size, tens of thousands of acres with variations in geology, especially thickness and porosity. And you have large landowners potentially where, over their 640 acres or several thousand acres, maybe in a unit, they're even just their own portion, very significantly. It can get pretty complex. When you get into a smaller unit, I think you could look at it and say, okay, well, we're generally 100 feet thick all the way across this unit, and that we have the same geologic conditions generally that we see. And so it's just easiest to say everybody's got this much acreage and move on at that point, allocating the benefit based on surface acreage. Even in the small ones, it can get complex if you start having to examine those variations in the geology. And so in many cases, even in oil and gas, they'll use surface acreage as a proxy for that. So
Thank you. So it was easier.
essentially.
Director, please move on. We've got, Representative Conrad. Heiner.
That's all right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, you're the one who poked me. Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, we've heard in testimony today that one of the potential risks of leakage from a reservoir is through a wellbore, whether it's plugged or otherwise. As we try to ascertain the geology, seems like we're putting a lot of pinholes in this reservoir as we're trying to determine the porosity and permeability and the thickness. So are we getting a more and more risk because we're trying to determine the relative ownership of that pore space rather than just say it's homogeneous throughout the whole area and limit the risks by not drilling so many wells, monitoring and core samples?
Director?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Heiner, I think much of the data that probably will be used for that type of examination of the pore space storage capacity will be from maybe some of those old penetrations. I don't know that people are contemplating, turning it into a pin cushion just to find out that data. They'll use data they have, they'll use seismic, they'll use some of these other methods as were discussed this morning for monitoring of the CO2, and then hopefully you get that for the data and be able to ascertain that, the need of that. So I don't think, we're not talking about. So, Mr. Chairman.
Director, please, and I will remind you, I would like to break at noon for lunch. We do have a full day. So we need to move on, and before lunch, I'd like to get if there is any public comment. So up to this point. So please.
Okay.
And I would like to get something from Director Parfit prior to lunch also.
Okay, Mr. Chairman.
Don't want to cut your presentation short, but please move on.
I'll move it up with a little speed here. So the last part on page 4 or slide 14 is that part of the statute that provides exclusive right to unit operations once the commission issues the order. And the reason that may be important, there's been questions raised, especially as it relates to BLM pore space and the right of way that gets issued by BLM, is does that give a single operator the exclusive right to use the pore space, or could the BLM or somebody else, private owner, issue multiple rights of way for the same pore space, or multiple leases for the same pore space? And regardless of whether that gives them exclusive right or not, once a party has a unitization order from the commission, that gives them exclusive right by the statute to utilize that pore space. So you couldn't have competing units, in the same formation or the same injection zone. And then maybe addressing a little bit Senator Ellis's question from earlier, there are no provisions in the unitization statutes. This is on slide 16 at the top that confer any right for eminent domain or to grant any person the right of eminent domain. And it also does not grant any person the right to use or access the surface estate that they would not otherwise already have. So the unitization does not provide that access versus dominant mineral estate, where if you have a lease or a unit, then you can have access to the surface so that you can access your minerals. And so now, Mr. Chairman, that's kind of what the commission needs to find and some of the conditions on their order, jumping in quickly to the complexities that this brings around. And I'll try to condense maybe the next 4 or 5 slides into just a general discussion. These are complex issues in front of the commission in oil and gas, and some of the ways the statutes are written for pore space makes them even more complex. And I'll think we had a fairly robust discussion on pore space and storage capacity and how that's determined. So I'll kind of skip over that on page 16 and 17. Those are the kinds of matters that the commission does here. They're well versed in that. So while there probably will be questions and potentially protests from pore space owners about their storage capacity allocation, the commission is well experienced in making those decisions. On slide 18, this is where we start talking about economic benefits, and this is really where the complexity comes in, especially when we talk about considering costs between pore space owners and unit operators and others. The statute says that the allocation of economic benefits needs to be fair and reasonable between pore space owners and the unit operator or others. And then that needs to be done taking into consideration the cost to capture, transport, and sequester the CO2. And so I think the allocation of benefits between pore space owners is fairly simple. You know, we're going to look at pore space storage capacity and make sure that they're getting their share of the total benefits of the unit based on their percent of storage capacity. What brings in the complexity on page 19 is when we start considering costs, and the statute indicates we have to consider that in the allocation of economic benefits and the cost to capture, transport, and sequester. So if we consider cost of capture, you know, we start thinking about who does that, who is doing the sequester or the capturing. It's probably not the unit operator, it's probably some third party. And so then what is their cost to capture? But then where do they bring in economic benefit? Do they, you know, we could consider carbon credits, the 45Q tax credit. You know, maybe they can sell their product for a higher price. So does that third party that may not even be involved in the sequestering have to, does the commission need to consider that economic benefit and that cost? You know, the statute indicates they do. Same for transport. It could be a different third party that runs a pipeline and transports the CO2. You know, do they receive a benefit by a payment of, you know, a per ton fee for whatever they're transporting through their pipeline? Could they get some other kind of credits or something? You know, how do we consider their costs and then their economic benefits? And then on 20, the sequestering, you know, that's likely the unit operator or some subsidiary of the unit operator or affiliated company. What is their cost? You know, their cost really is compliance with the Class 6 permits from DEQ. So that's fairly simple. But then how do they generate their economic benefit of the sequestering? And are they getting paid a per ton fee? Are they getting a tax credit? Are they getting a carbon credit? You know, when we have when these companies are disconnected between these processes, it becomes really complex to look at costs and benefits. And in reality, it's really the sequestration that then creates all those other benefits, right? If you don't sequester the CO2, then the person who captures it has no benefit from capturing it. The sequestration really is what generates all of the benefit along those processes of capturing, transporting, and sequestering. So if we consider that just in a hypothetical project, you know, the project in North Dakota, for example, is an ethanol plant where they're capturing CO2 from the ethanol plant and sequestering it. And so if we use that as a hypothetical for Wyoming, you take a ethanol plant in Colorado or Nebraska or some other state, you bring in the CO2. So maybe they're capturing the ethanol plant themselves are capturing the CO2. And they're going to sell their ethanol now as carbon neutral. And so they get a higher price for that. So does the commission need to take that benefit into consideration? Maybe they get a carbon credit, maybe because they've generated this carbon sequestration. Maybe they get a 45Q tax credit. Maybe they're claiming that at the ethanol plant. So does the commission need to consider that? Then the pipeline company, you know, maybe they're just getting paid a fee, and maybe theirs is fairly simple. They're just getting paid to transport it. But then the sequestration company, what do they get? Is the ethanol plant paying them a per ton injection fee? and that's all the benefit there, or is it the sequester that's actually capturing the tax credits and the carbon credits? And so then that's, that's complex enough, but then when you consider maybe 5 years from now, they bring on a cement plant or they bring on a power plant into the same unit that was sequestering CO2 from the ethanol plant. And everybody was sharing in the benefits from the, that sequestration from the ethanol plant. But then what happens when we do it 5 years from now with the cement plant, and their economics are different on what they can capture? Does the commission need to reopen that unit and reallocate all the new benefits and benefits that the ethanol plant was getting? Or, it really gets complex when you consider that these projects may go for decades and add in more and more sources of CO2. And so, again, we can think of a lot of hypotheticals and toss around a lot of ideas of how this should be handled. This is considering that the commission has had no applications for sequestration yet for unitization. And so, the commission will need to address some of these issues as we get these first applications in. But those are the concerns and the questions that we've brought up to the commission, and so that they understand what the statutes require. And, the statutes do say between the pore space owners and the unit operator or others. And so that or other statement makes you think, that all, and when it brings in the cost to capture, transport, and sequester, it makes me think that we need to identify all those and consider them, because that, the statute seems fairly clear in that part of the
Representative
requirement.
Lawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. We talked earlier about the pore space being conveyed under Wyoming statute with the surface ownership unless it's been otherwise severed in some way. Do you have any information about currently, right now, how much has been severed? Obviously, we're entering into a whole new era, which is giving a kind of economic value to pore space, that it's never had before. So I'm just wondering where we stand in this moment, or where we can go to get that information of as we enter into that and consider where we are now versus where it's obviously headed. Thank you.
Director. Mr. Chairman, Representative Lawley, I don't have an idea of how much has been severed now. I know there has been pore space leasing occurring. But my guess is there's been very minimal that has been severed from the surface estate, because it's really been in the last year or so that this has been brought back to the forefront, since the statutes were passed in 2009. So, it's possible there's been some severed, but likely not very much. And those records would be found in the county property records, along with other issues there. So,
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Senator Rothfuss.
And Mr. Chairman, I know I should stop asking questions, but
No, you can ask questions.
Mr. Chairman, the curiosity I have, when you're contemplating that economic benefit, if there were a group of landowners that knew that they had a tremendous asset and they wanted to unitize effectively on spec, where they were just trying to go down the regulatory path with an expectation that they would potentially be able to put something together, but the unitization seemed like a reasonable first step so that they could have their legal structure in place. Would that even be viable under existing statutes, since there isn't a specific use case in mind, since it is effectively on spec? Or how would that be handled?
Director.
Mr. Chairman, I think it could be possible for someone to do, but I don't know that it could get through the commission with some of the findings they need to make. We would need to know what the plume size is, for example, because is the unit size that they're proposing appropriate, without knowing what they're injecting or how many injection wells they might have, or the volumes they plan to do. So I think, I really think the commission would not be able to issue an effective order that would be able to unitize something without actual plans in place for wells. The DEQ, at least an application submitted to DEQ before they could do that. And in fact, the application to the commission requires that they have at least a copy of the application to the DEQ, if not a draft permit or the permit from DEQ in their unitization application.
Go ahead.
Mr. Chairman, I think that really wraps up. I had a last slide. We talked about it already about, again, kind of that difference between pooling, compulsory pooling and unitization. And I think what again, to just reiterate, the commission has not heard one of these. We have not received an application for unitization at this time. So obviously these questions will be looked at outside the hypothetical realm and with an actual project in the near future. When we get the first application, we expect to receive those this year, at least one, if not more than one. But I think, so they'll start to wade through those issues as they start to review that a real application, but hopefully what we've presented today really just gives you a better understanding of where the statutes are right now, the complexity of what we have for unitization statutes. And as you mentioned, Mr. Chairman, maybe a discussion later today on, some potential changes to that to help clarify or maybe streamline the process. And so, but this gives hopefully a better understanding of what is required today in statute for this process.
Other questions for
Mr. Chairman?
Director Crowpatch? Director, I know your official title is supervisor, but director sounds better.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes, go ahead, Representative Western.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, just on that last thing you talked about in terms of kind of the order of operations and what you'll consider, if them simply just having an application into DEQ, is that sufficient for you guys to begin your process, or do you need for you guys to approve their application to you? Does it first have to be approved by DEQ as well, or do you guys issue like a conditional approval, or what would that look like?
Director?
Mr. Chairman and Representative Western, and Director Parfit, you can provide some more detail if I get anything wrong here, but I think for us, we just need a copy of their application, the official application to DEQ. We could also take a copy of the DEQ draft permit or permit. I think in the DEQ regulations, the unitization has to be done before they can issue the final permit to inject. But so somewhere in that process, it's really a concurrent process at the commission and at DEQ for permit of the Class 6 well and for the unitization of the pore space. And really the data from the Class 6 permit is what's going to inform the commission on unit size and some of the geologic details related to pore space and storage capacity. So I think the collection of the data really begins with DEQ, and then at some point after that application is submitted, then they can start the process for unitization. And at the commission, the process, assuming, everybody's in agreement and there's not additional issues related to technicalities of geology or other things, it's a 45-day process from application to hearing at the commission. So it's not a long-term process where they apply and it takes a year to get a permit or a unitization order. It's a 45-day application period so that we can complete our notices and then the commission hearing, and it would be effective, assuming everything's there that needs to be there for the commission to issue the order.
Follow up, Representative Western?
No, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Okay, thank you. Representative Western, I need to ask that because I've got to turn all the way around to see you. We only have one screen in the room. Okay, other questions? So, Director, I do have one backing up to enhanced oil recovery. So you have a formation, you're producing oil out of it. You've already taken care of all of the issues of pooling that if need be, and those are all handled. Okay, so now you go in and you go change to going into enhanced oil recovery. Do you take into account the plume that is going to be generated, or do you just take it on the basis of what's already been established as pooling for the original pooling for that formation and for that production of oil?
Mr. Chairman, it depends on what has occurred within the field. So when we start looking at CO2 injection for enhanced recovery, typically that's already been a field that has water flood occur. And so the water flood unitization would likely be sufficient for the transfer of the project into CO2 injection. But we'd have to look at it again and make sure that the unitized area was sufficient. And it would be a similar process to what we would do for unitization of the pore space. We'd look at the field, the extent of the pool, where the oil is, which mineral owner, how much oil in place is, original oil in place is still on their leasehold interest, and assign that portion of the production to that owner. It'd be a similar process, but likely already done if we just talk about CO2 injection, because it likely went through water flood before that.
So Director, at each point where you change the method of production, you initially use the reservoir pressure, then you go to water flood, then CO2. At each of those changes, then the commission does a review of that particular well field production method. Am I
Mr.
correct?
Chairman, we do, especially from primary into some kind of secondary or tertiary enhanced recovery type project, that those would require similar UIC permitting processes for the class 2 well, and ensuring that injection of the fluid, whether it's water or CO2 or some other, gas or some other kind of fluid that's going to enhance the recovery is going to remain in the injection zone, that it's going to, that the oil is going to be recovered. We're not going to push oil off that, outside the field or unit or plume or pool that, is going to harm someone's correlative rights. So we go through a very similar process to unitize for water flood. Once it's unitized for water flood and you have approval to inject either water, CO2 or something like that, then there's less of a process because it's been done. We've reviewed that information. And so that's more of an administrative approval to change from water to CO2 or from water to, polymer or gas or something else that they might want to use. That's less process because we've already looked at it for the water flood injection. But once we go from primary to water flood or other enhanced, that's where we do most of our work.
Any other questions? Okay, so I think with that, Director Parfit, we're on to you.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name's Todd Parfit. I'm the Director of the Department of Environmental Quality. With me today to help with the presentation is Jennifer Zigmund. She's the Water Quality Division Administrator. And also with us here is Lily Barkow. She is the Program Manager for the groundwater section and our resident expert on Class 6 carbon sequestration. And I was also just like to point out for Ms. Barkow is that she was appointed by the Council on Environmental Quality to the Task Force on Responsible Development and Deployment of Carbon Capture Utilization and Storage. And I would ask them to join me up here as well.
So Director, for that appointment of Ms. Barkow, that was the White House Council on Environment and Quality, correct?
Mr. Chairman, that is correct.
Okay. So, I guess congratulations are in order.
So, Mr. Chairman, we have 4 parts, and I think we can just do them sequentially here. But we're going to cover a little bit of background on the UIC program generally, and then talk a little bit about primacy and why that was important. We'll cover the permitting process. Ms. Barkow will walk us through that. And then we'll go into the fee structure for the program. And then wrap it up with a conversation around emerging issues with pore space and interstate pore space. So with that, I think we owe a response to a question earlier this morning. And I think the 5 of us put our heads together and think we have a suitable answer.
So if you can answer Representative Lawley's question, proceed.
Okay, well, I hope I can. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. But the question generally was, who makes the determination on the eligibility and qualification for the 45Q tax credits? And then how is that determined by that entity? And the first part of that question would be the IRS is going to make that determination. That's not made at the agency level. However, I will say that the monitoring, reporting, and verification process that we have established for Class 6 wells will be important for us as well, because we will be looking at a 7 cent per ton fee as part of the process. And so we have a process that I would suspect that the IRS would be interested in to verify the operations in Wyoming.
Representative, does that answer your question?
Indeed, it does. Thank you so much.
All right. Okay, to start out, as I said, we're going to do an overview of the EPA's UIC program and why the primacy is important for Wyoming. So the Safe Drinking Water Act directs EPA to develop an underground injection control program and the requirements that protect underground sources of drinking water, often referred to as USDWs. So if you hear that USDW, that's an underground source of drinking water. So primacy is where a state takes on the responsibility of implementing a federally required program that doesn't take EPA out of the picture. EPA approves the agreement to become primacy. And then they also provide oversight to ensure that we continue to implement appropriately. Currently, there are 34 states that have primacy over some types of classes of UIC wells. Wyoming received its primacy for class 1 through class 5 wells back in 1983. So we've been doing it for quite some time. Primacy for the UIC class 6 wells was issued to Wyoming in September of 2020. We were the second state to receive primacy of class 6 wells. North Dakota was the first, and then Louisiana is going through a process right now. I think they're in the Federal Register for public comment. So there are 6 federal classes of underground injection control wells. The DEQ's Water Quality Division is responsible for implementation of 3 of those 6. So there are what's called class 1 wells. Those are hazardous and non-hazardous wastes that are injected into deep isolated rock formations, and the key part being below the lowest underground source of drinking water. Just to give you some perspective, we have 51 active class 1 wells in the state. Class 5 wells inject non-hazardous fluids into or above an underground source of drinking water. We have quite a few of those throughout the state. About 1,000 of those are covered under an individual or general permit, and then we have another 2,000 or a little bit more than that that are authorized by rule. And then we have the class 6 wells. And this is, as we've been talking about, to inject carbon dioxide for long-term storage and geologic sequestration. And I think there's a word missing in the slides that we provided. It should say below the lowest underground source of drinking water. And right now we have 5 permit applications in-house, and we'll talk a little bit about those later. And then we have, there's class 2, 3, and 4 wells. The class 2 wells, we just talked a little bit about. Those are managed and implemented by the Wyoming Oil and Gas Commission. And those are discharges associated with oil and natural gas production. Class 3 wells are implemented by our Land Quality Division, and those are the wells where they inject fluids to dissolve and extract minerals. An example would be the in situ uranium mining. And then lastly are the class 4 wells, and those are no longer permissible. These were injections of hazardous or radioactive fluids into a underground source of drinking water, and there are none of those present in Wyoming. All right, so why primacy? First thing, it's important to understand that 95% of federal environmental programs are implemented by the states, and that's nationally. So the structure is that EPA develops the standards and the states implement the programs. So without primacy, the UIC program is implemented by EPA at its regional offices. And this map shows you basically how the regions, you can't see it behind you, but on the screen, and you should have the slide of the map of the United States, shows where those regional offices are for EPA. So currently there are 76 class 6 permit applications that are under review with EPA. And those are in regions 4, 5, 6, and 9. 2 of those class 6 wells 2 of the 76 class 6 wells were issued by EPA Region 5, so that's out of Chicago, and were under review for roughly 6 years before they were issued. Without the primacy that we have for the class 6, the program would be implemented out of Region 8, which is in Denver, and they would oversee all of the elements of the class 6 process. So on the next slide, so why the primacy? The biggest thing is Wyoming knows Wyoming. As I mentioned, we've had primacy for class 1 through class 5 wells since 1983. And then the class 1 and class 2 wells share the similar complexity that you would see in a class 6 well. We've had that experience of permitting these wells both at the DEQ and the Oil and Gas Commission, and that expertise and knowledge is transferable to class 6 wells. And then on the next slide, Wyoming statutes and regulations are already in place for permitting, unitization, pore space, the title of CO2, long-term stewardship, and then the transfer of liability. That all exists in Wyoming statute or rule. The federal UIC program does not speak to unitization, doesn't address pore space, or the title of CO2 and long-term stewardship or liability. So permits can be issued. We've seen this in other programs besides the water program and the UIC program, but permits at the state level can be issued quicker because agency staff are dedicated to Wyoming. EPA permits can take up to 6 years, where we have assessed that we can issue final permits under the Class 6 program within a year and a half.
Representative Conrad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Director Parfit. With the manpower issues, are you still able to, I guess, execute in the timeframe that you believe is expedient?
Director? So, Mr. Chairman, Representative Conrad, that's a fluid question, because with the existing staff right now, with the applications that we have in-house, the answer is yes. As we take on more Class 6 permits, we will have more tasks to complete, because you issue the permit, then you have the oversight of the ongoing operations of the facility. And then you're also then bringing in new permits. So we are evaluating that. We were appreciative that we added an FTE last session to the program to be able to manage the workload that we're seeing and projecting for the rest of the biennium. We will be working through our budget process here in the next month and making or developing our recommendations for the budget this coming session.
Thank you. Proceed. Oh, I'm sorry. Representative Heiner. See, I got it correct this time.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Director, you say that your goal is 18 months for a Class 6 well application. Yet it seems like some of this is out of your control in the DEQ, because your policy is that you have to have unitization before you can be permitted, receive the final permit. So in previous testimony, we heard that there's no applications for unitization yet, and yet you have some applications that are getting close to the 18-month time period. So it seems like there's got to be a lot of things coming to fruition at the same time, and it's not all under your control to be able to do both sides there. So is this going to hinder our ability to meet this timeline, the aggressive timeline, which I very much applaud? Is it going to slow us down any with those two parallel paths?
Yes.
Director.
So, Mr. Chairman, Representative Heiner, yeah, this was the last point I was going to make on the last slide. So thank you for that. The year and a half depends on the quality of the application that we receive, first off. And then the permit will actually be in two parts. So the first part of the permit is the construction part of the permit. And that's where what we're saying is 6 to 8 months is about an appropriate time, depending on the quality of the application. We can issue that permit without the unitization order from the Oil and Gas Commission so that the entity or the company can then drill the well, collect any additional information they need to make application for the second part of the permit, which is the injection and operation of the well. Could unitization in and of itself create a delay in the process? I would say, yeah, probably so. If there was a delay in the unitization order, because we can't issue the permit for the injection and the operation until there's a unitization order issued by the commission.
Proceed.
So, Mr. Chairman, that concludes the kind of the background overview of the UIC programs. And so I would just like to turn it over to the next topic, which is the permitting process for Class 6, and let Ms. Barco walk through that.
Ms. Barco.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't think that was me. Okay. Again, my name is Lily Barkow. I'm the groundwater section manager for the Water Quality Division. I oversee the underground injection control program for classes 1, 5, and 6. I'm going to apologize in advance for these sets of slides. Some of the slides are missing page numbers, slides 4 through 9 and 11 through 14. They were accidentally deleted during the final preparation of this presentation. So I'm going to give an overview.
Go ahead, please continue. The director and I have been figuring out the electronics.
Be discussing carbon capture, utilization, and storage, and where does the DEQ Class 6 fit into this process, discussing the sequestration permitting process at DEQ of the various steps to complete this process, and then the current permit applications we have in-house and under review at DEQ. So as mentioned earlier, this is slide 3. There are several stages of the carbon capture, transportation, utilization, and storage. Of those 4 areas shown here, the DEQ permitting process focuses on storage or the permanent sequestration, thousands of feet into the subsurface, and that's area number 4 on this slide. Next slide, please. So this slide is an overview of the Class 6 permitting, operating, enclosure, and long-term stewardship process. For ease of reading, a larger printout is available at the end of the packet. Key items that I'd like to point out on this slide is, for notation, is responsibilities. The green boxes are operator responsibilities. The yellow is DEQ's, gray is the Oil and Gas Commission, and blue is the regulatory review and permitting activities that are conducted. So the next slide here. We start the process off with an informational meeting. This is to go over the scope of the project that's being proposed, the location, discussing any property and mineral ownership that's been identified, and then available site characterization data that is available. As you've heard through this morning, site characterization and understanding of the geologic formations is very important to the success of these projects. We also encourage the applicant to reach out to the other agencies to discuss the project early in the process to gain an understanding of the needs that they may have. If an operator believes that they have to acquire additional information to support the site characterization to complete their Class 6 application, They may seek to construct a stratigraphic test well. These are permitted through the Oil and Gas Commission through their online permitting form. We have a site characterization fact sheet or informational sheet to help operators identify the data that they should consider collecting to support their Class 6 application. This information would be beneficial to collect during that strat well. The strat well cannot be converted to a monitoring well or Class 6 well through this process without the Class 6 permit. At least the first one to permit to construct. DEQ requests a pre-application meeting. This is held 45 days prior to an application being submitted. This is when they will meet with other programs at DEQ to understand other permitting requirements that may exist. This is also a time where DEQ prepares a cost estimate to determine the permit application fee, which is submitted as part of the application process. And this is to get an understanding of what's coming in, prepare for that application, and getting staff and accounting updated. So the application is broken down into two parts. There's a general administrative informational section, just your typical administrative data. And then the technical information, which has been it's provided in a format that's been approved by DEQ. And it includes the project information, well construction, operations, monitoring. There are a number of required plans per the rule that they submit as well, financial assurance, cost estimates, and a number of other things. These are very technical and lengthy reports that are submitted. The ones that we've been receiving, they're upwards of 300 to 400 pages in length that we're receiving. So it's really important that these are provided in the format that we've outlined. So the application, it is for a single well. We are not allowed to do area permits. So each permit application is for that single well. It is submitted in the format, as I mentioned, approved by the administrator. The fee is provided with the application. Again, that's derived from the pre-application meeting. Staff use a checklist that we've put together to document the presence or absence of information, and as well as provides consistency across the board as we're reviewing all of these applications.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A quick question on the fact that it's an application for a single well versus multiple for a zone or something along those lines. Is that required by our agreement through the EPA for primacy, or is that our own internal approach to it, is to have a single application for a single well?
Mr. Chairman, this is a federal requirement, and as part of our primacy.
And quick follow-up, if I wanted to do 3 wells, we'll say into the same zone, 3 injection points or something along those lines, I assume that would be something that could be done in parallel. I'm applying for all 3 of them at the same time, and they'd be reviewed concurrently. Is that accurate?
Ms. Barkow.
Mr. Chairman, yes. And in fact, we have received 3 applications at the same time and conducted those reviews.
Perfect. All right. Good example. Yeah. Thank you.
Representative Conrad.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Just a question on applicability, or more importantly, in 300 pages electronically, and what's the vehicle to submit? Impact, Midas?
Ms.
Mr.
Barkow.
Chairman, currently it is through the Water Quality Division has a permitting portal for submitting all documents electronically, any type of mail. We are currently working on a permitting system to submit those documents electronically and to follow through a permitting process.
Thank you.
Proceed.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In regards to these applications, the primary objective of DEQ's review is, again, to evaluate for the protection of those underground sources of drinking water.
a question that comes up quite often is in regards to aquifer exemptions. These aquifer exemptions, they're primarily for class 1 and 2. They are overseen by the EPA. The EPA is not currently allowing new aquifer exemptions for class 6 wells. Class 6 wells, they are required again to inject below the lowest most USDW, or the operator can request a depth waiver where they will inject between 2 USDWs, or they can request an expansion of an already existing class 2 aquifer exemption. We are following this topic as further discussions occur nationally, mainly due to the lack of federal clarity on the process of how to get these depth waivers and aerial expansions, as well as a process to use existing exemptions already issued under the class 1 program. So seeking a depth waiver or aerial expansion is one of those areas that's beyond DEQ's control, and it could result in major delays in permitting.
Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm sorry, I got lost. What is an aquifer exemption and why would we need one?
Ms. Barkow.
Mr. Chairman, because the requirement specifically for class 1 wells, deep disposal wells, is to inject below the lowest most USDW. This can result in injection into formations thousands and thousands of feet deep, 10,000 or greater. So that your lowest most USDW may actually be at 10,000 feet. It will never be used for drinking water purposes, and therefore we would seek to exempt that aquifer to turn the above aquifer into the lowest most USDW. And then we could inject into that one, which meets the porosity, permeability, and other factors for injections.
Okay, proceed.
So as Director Parfit noted earlier, we're breaking our permit into 2 parts. The first is the permit to construct issuance. There is a 60-day public comment period that occurs once we've determined that the application is complete. We will hold a public hearing at the end of that public comment and notice period. And then prior to issuance of that permit to construct, financial assurance or bonding is required for permitting and characterization. That's the additional data that's collected during the well construction phase of the project. Any testing and monitoring that's conducted on that constructed well, and then plugging and abandonment financial assurance costs for that well that was constructed. A permit may be issued in 1 year or less. Again, if the permit application follows the format approved by the administrator, and also dependent on the responsiveness of the operator to any comments we may have developed under reviewing the application. The next step of the permitting process, the operator will construct the well and any associated monitoring wells. They'll collect any additional information from those drilling activities, conduct pre-operational testing. They'll take that data and compare it to the information based off of the original application submitted. It's basically to ground truth the information that they've provided earlier on in regards to reservoir type, porosity, permeability, cap seals, or seeing if they're going to need to modify any parts of the application now with very specific site information. Any of this new or different information that's been collected from the original application is submitted to DEQ as a permit modification. So once
Representative Conrad.
I apologize. Does that reset the time frame or time clock?
Ms. Barkow.
Mr. Chairman, so could you provide clarification as to reset?
Yeah.
Representative.
Once that the resubmittal, does it pick up where it left off or does it go back into the process of review for permitting?
Ms. Barkow?
Mr. Chairman, it does not restart the clock at that point. Only the portions that are being modified are reviewed and are subject to any public notice and comment requirements. The rest of the permit remains the same.
Thank you.
Continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So as mentioned, only those portions of the original application requiring modification are subject to the public notice. If that were the case, then those portions go through a 60-day public comment period. We would then hold a hearing for those portions at the end. As mentioned earlier, at this point, we would need the unitization order to be issued by the Oil and Gas Conservation Commission. We would need any remaining financial assurance for the operations, including the injections, post-injection site care, and an emergency and remedial response plan be provided to DEQ. In addition, they are required to carry liability insurance. And then at that point, that final permit allowing for the operation and injection, sometimes also referred to as the authorization to inject, could be issued.
Senator Ellis.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. For the 60-day, the director shall issue a decision. If a decision hasn't been issued by that deadline, is it deemed approved? Or what happens if you're a day late or 2 days late? What happens if you don't meet that deadline?
Mr. Chairman.
Ms. Barkow.
The primary focus of that determination is in order to address any comments. That decision could occur much sooner, depending on the number of comments received during the public comment period. But it should occur within those 60 days, again, if not shorter.
All right, continue.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As mentioned earlier, we have 5 applications. They're presented here in the order of submittal. We received our first in 2021. And then, as mentioned a moment ago, we did receive 3 applications together. And then a more recent one here at the end of March. Combined, these applications for the total that would be sequestered is around a little over 36 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. And we should be going to public comments fairly soon for the permit to construct on some of these applications. And
Representative Heiner.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Could you give us a status? So just clarification, none of these have received a permit to construct at this point. Is that being held up because of the operator or because of something external to the DEQ that unforeseen? What's holding some of these up that we're getting into this time period? One of them looks like almost a year and a half now. So, what are the obstacles, I guess?
Ms. Barkow.
Mr. Chairman, the obstacles, again, submitting the document in a format as approved by the administrator. The first particular one, it was the first submitted. The condition of the application caused a number of comments to be generated. The responsiveness of the applicant is a large factor in those. We are working with the applicants. After we provide those comments, we encourage meetings to regularly discuss and work through those. They do have a number of comments that they have to work through. So that it's mainly the operator at that point.
Ms. Barkow.
Mr. Chairman, that concludes my presentation on the DEQ permitting process.
Okay. Any other questions on DEQ permitting? Okay, thank you. So at this point, it's a good place to break for lunch. Because then when we come back, we start getting into work on proposed legislation. And that, however, we've gone all morning. At this point, I will take public comment. How many in the room wish to make public comment on things we've discussed this morning? Okay, one. Anyone online?
Mr. Chairman, if there is someone online, if they would just raise their hand if they wish to comment at this time.
No. Okay, so no one online. And we've gone in well into the lunch hour, so I'll open it to public comment. We have one comment, but I will limit it to 5 minutes because we will come back from lunch at 1, which means an abbreviated lunch. Senator, Mr. Co-Chair, quick on lunch.
Little housekeeping on lunch. We're providing lunch for everybody in this room and it's right next door. Cameron Diamondville Chamber of Commerce is doing that. Loaded up with enchiladas, a lot of other things, and that's so we can expedite the lunch and keep working. So everybody in committee and everybody in this room, you're invited to lunch next door and they've set up a nice room in there with tables and everything. So let's go to our public comment.
Okay, so public comment, proceed. You have 5 minutes, and as most people know, when I give a time limit, it's clocked. So please proceed, identify yourself for the record.
Thank you, Chairman. My name is Robert Mark Armstrong. I am commenting as a person, and I hope you take note of Harriet Hagman's House Bill 288, which is the beginning over the overturning of Chevron et al. Deference to bureaucrats. It came out of committee and it should pass the House. That being said, I am a licensed professional geologist. And if you're going to talk about health effects, you must be licensed to practice. And so I gave the LSO a packet, a PDF. In that, it included climate at a glance and the 30 prominent climate topics that have been debunked in this fairly easily.
Mr. Armstrong, I will remind you, we are talking about carbon capture, utilization, sequestration.
I understand that.
And ask you to stay to that subject.
Thank you. So I'm happy that the oil industry, my friends in the oil industry, have determined a way to undermine or get around some of the onerous aspects of government regulatory control of their industry. So carbon capture, as has been pointed out numerous times this morning, has been done by the oil and gas industry for years. And the fact that we're talking about CO2 is based on climate and the political aspects thereof. And in my package, I gave you numerous articles, professional articles in science, digestive science, the geophysics journal, other journals. And so let's talk about CO2 and temperature of the earth for just a second. So in the initial studies in the mid-80s, we went out and did vesicle research, the little holes in the ice cores. And initially, what we see is a change in the oxygen 18, oxygen 16 ratio. And then after that change, that is a temperature variance indicator. Then after that, in time, you see the CO2 increase. Also, you see 4 variances in the Pleistocene, all of them directly associated with magnetic reversals. It's on my webpage. And so now the question is, before man was here, how did CO2, man-caused CO2, cause climate variance? Well, those directly relate to magnetic pole reversal. So, we have a government growing because of CO2. This complexity in the law is going to be very difficult to one, write a law that is administratable, and two, the complexity of the formation you want to inject CO2 in is going to be very hard and, you know, probably financially burdensome to go through the permitting process. I do permits all the time for clients, and that is burdensome. And a government that governs least governs best.
Mr. Armstrong, thank you. That is 5 minutes.
Thank you.
And we do need
Really?
to get on. Yes.
Thank you. Have a
and
good
are there
night.
any-
Thank you for your time.
Are there any questions for Mr. Armstrong? Okay. All right. Thank you. With that, we'll recess for lunch. We'll be back at 1 o'clock, and I'm going by the clocks in the back of the room.